Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It had been raining for hours by the time we decided to stop for the night. The forecast had said scattered showers, but it turned into a steady downpour that turned the dirt roads into slippery paths. Our plan was simple: drive out to the woods, set up camp, and get away from everything for a weekend. It was supposed to be a break from work, stress, all that. None of us thought to check if the spot we picked was public land. It just looked like a good place to pitch a tent, and it was getting dark fast. There were 4 of us: me, Jason, Claire, and Matt. We parked near a clearing by the trees. It wasn't an official campsite, but it looked secluded and quiet. We got the tents up quickly despite the rain. The sound of the drops hitting the canvas was loud but kind of calming. After that, we sat around under a tarp Jason had brought, trying to keep the fire going with damp wood. We laughed a bit, told some stories, but we were all soaked, so the fun didn't last long. By 11, we gave up and went to bed. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The rain had lightened up, just a faint tapping against the tent now. Everything was quiet except for that. I thought maybe I had heard an animal or something, but when I listened closer, I heard voices. Low, angry voices. I unzipped the sleeping bag carefully and leaned toward the tent door, straining to hear. Jason's tent was closest to mine, and I could hear him whispering to someone. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone wasn't good. He sounded scared. Then I heard another voice, deep and sharp, cutting through the rain. "You've got no right to be here," it said. I froze. I could tell it wasn't one of us, and it was angry. I peeked through the small mesh window on the tent and saw a flashlight beam swinging around outside. It landed on Jason's face for a second, and he winced. The light moved, and then I saw him, an older man, tall and broad, wearing a camo jacket and a white-brimmed hat. He was holding a rifle. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The man pointed the rifle at the ground near Jason's feet and barked, "You think you can just walk onto someone's property and do whatever you like? Who gave you permission?" Jason stammered something about not knowing, about it being an accident. The man didn't seem to care. His voice got louder. "An accident? You think that makes it okay? You've got 10 seconds to pack up and leave, or I'll make you leave. You hear me?" I wanted to get up, to help Jason somehow, but I was terrified. I didn't know if the man would see me as a threat or if he'd just turn the gun on me too. I stayed crouched in the tent, gripping my phone, even though I had no signal out here. Claire must have heard it too, because I saw the light from her phone flashlight flicker on in her tent. That was a mistake. The man noticed it immediately. "Who else is out here?" he shouted, swinging the rifle toward her tent. He stomped toward it, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. "Come out. Now!" Jason tried to say something, maybe to calm him down, but the man shoved him backward. Jason stumbled and fell, landing hard in the mud. Claire unzipped her tent slowly and stepped out with her hands up, shaking. Matt's tent was still zipped shut, no movement from inside. He was either frozen like me or still asleep somehow. The man's face was pale and lined, and his eyes were wild. He waved a rifle between Jason and Claire, spitting questions. "How many of you are there? What are you doing here? You spying on me?" Claire stammered something about just camping, just passing through. The man didn't seem to believe her. He kept muttering under his breath, things like, liars, and think you can sneak around my land. Then he looked at her tent, then Jason's, then mine. His eyes narrowed. There's more of you, isn't there? Come out, all of you. I didn't know what to do. If I stayed hidden, he might think we were trying to trick him, but if I came out, I didn't know what he'd do. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Finally, I unzipped the tent slowly, keeping my hands visible. I stepped out into the wet grass, my socks soaking through instantly. The man stared at me, his jaw tight. Another one, he said, almost to himself. He pointed the rifle toward the last tent mats. What about him? Before I could answer, Matt's tent unzipped. He came out with his hands up like the rest of us, his face pale and scared. The man stared at all four of us, his flashlight flickering over each of our faces. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just breathed heavily. Then he spat on the ground and said, "You've got 5 minutes. Pack up and get off my land. If I see you here again, I'll shoot first and ask questions later." None of us moved right away. He shouted, "Now," and that got us going. We scrambled to take down the tents, our hands fumbling with the wet fabric and slippery poles. The man stood there the whole time, his rifle resting on his hip, watching us with cold eyes. It took longer than 5 minutes, but he didn't stop us. He just kept muttering to himself, shaking his head like we'd done something personal to him. When we finally had everything packed, we started toward the car. Jason tried to apologize again, but the man cut him off. "Just go," he said. "And don't come back." We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the car, and Jason started it up, the tires spinning a little in the mud before catching. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the man still standing there, his flashlight beam following us until we were out of sight. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road, miles away. No one said much after that. We just sat there, soaked and shaken, the rain still pounding on the roof. We knew we'd been lucky. The man could have done a lot worse than yell at us. I still think about him sometimes, the way he looked at us, like we weren't people, just intruders. It makes me wonder what he was so afraid of or what he was hiding. I went out camping by myself for the first time in a long time. I usually went with a group, but I had been feeling kind of drained from everything and thought some quiet time would help. It was a spot I'd been to before, not far from a trailhead. It wasn't an official campground, but it was a clear area near a creek tucked into the woods. I set up my tent, had a quick meal, and just sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The weather was good, cool, no rain, and the stars were out. I turned in early, around 9 or so. I was tired from hiking in and setting up camp, and honestly, I was looking forward to a good night's sleep. I had packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a few supplies. I kept my food in a bag tied up in a tree, about 20 feet from the campsite, like I'd always been told to do. You don't want animals getting into it. I woke up later, and at first, I wasn't sure why. My eyes opened in the dark, and I just lay there, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard a low, crunching sound, like something heavy stepping on twigs and leaves. It was close. My tent was small, with only a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there, and I could hear every little sound. The crunching stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. Then I heard another noise, a deep, wet snuffling sound. It was loud, and it sent a cold shock through me. I knew right away what it was. A bear. There was no mistaking it. My heart started pounding. I lay as still as I could, staring up at the roof of the tent, listening. The bear moved closer, and I heard the sound of my food bag being torn at. The rope I'd used to hang it up must not have been high enough. I felt stupid for not checking it better, but now it didn't matter. All I could think was that it was right there, and if it wanted to, it could easily come toward the tent next. The sound of the bear tearing into the bag went on for what felt like forever. It huffed and grunted, and every so often, there was a loud crunch as it bit into something. I was too scared to move, even though I knew I should try to make noise or do something to scare it off. But what if that just made it mad? I didn't have anything to protect myself, no gun or bear spray, just a small camping knife that was still in my backpack. Even if I had it in my hand, I knew it wouldn't do much. I thought about trying to reach for my phone to check the time, but it was in the corner of the tent, and I didn't dare move. I didn't even want to unzip the sleeping bag. I just stayed frozen, listening. My whole body felt tense, like my muscles were locked up, and every little sound the bear made seemed to echo inside my head. At one point, I heard it moving again. The heavy steps came closer, slow and deliberate. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, just faint but there. It was coming toward the tent. My chest felt tight, and I thought I might stop breathing altogether. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would somehow help. The bear sniffed loudly, right next to the tent. I could hear it so clearly that I felt like I could picture it in my head, its nose brushing against the fabric, the sound of its breath, low and rumbling. My mind kept racing, imagining what would happen if it decided to push through. I could feel tears starting to well up, but I didn't move. I just kept telling myself to stay still, to stay quiet, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. The bear circled the tent, slow and steady. I could hear its claws scraping the ground as it moved, and every step felt like it lasted an eternity. At one point, it stopped, and I thought maybe it had gone back to the food. But then I heard it again, closer this time, its breath heavy and loud. I couldn't tell how long it stayed near the tent. Time felt stretched out and strange, like hours were passing even though it might have only been minutes. Finally, the bear let out a low grunt and moved away. I could hear it walking back toward where the food bag had been, the steps growing fainter. I didn't move. I stayed curled up in the sleeping bag, my fists clenched so tight that my hands were sore. I was too scared to do anything, too scared to even think clearly. The noises from the bear went on for a while longer, but they were farther away now. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there, every little creak or rustle making my heart race all over again. When the first light started to come through the tent, I finally dared to unzip it and look outside. The food bag was gone, completely torn off the rope and dragged away somewhere. There were deep claw marks in the dirt and mud near the tree, and even some on the tree trunk itself. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time, and I kept looking around, expecting to see the bear coming back. By the time I was on the trail heading back to my car, the sun was fully up, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise in the woods made me jump. When I finally got back to my car and locked the doors, I felt like I could breathe again. I sat there for a long time before I started the engine, just trying to calm down. Even now, thinking about it makes my stomach twist. It's not like I was attacked or anything, but being that close to something so powerful and knowing there's nothing you can do, it stays with you. It makes you feel small. We'd all gone out camping to this spot one of us had found online, tucked way back in the woods off some dirt road. It wasn't anything fancy, just a clearing near a stream with enough space for our tents and a small fire pit. There were 5 of us, me, Mark, Julia, Chris, and Mia. We'd set up camp in the late afternoon, cooked dinner over the fire, and stayed up for a while talking and laughing. The woods were quiet that night, just the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. It was peaceful. We all went to bed around midnight. We were packed into 2 tents, me, Mark, and Chris in one, and Julia and Mia in the other. Everything felt normal. I don't know what woke me up, but when I opened my eyes, it was still dark. It had to have been early morning. The air felt colder, and the fire outside had burned down to just embers. Mark was snoring quietly next to me, and Chris was still, too. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out why I was awake. Then I noticed it, a faint sound, like something moving outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of leaves, soft but close. I held my breath and strained to listen, but it stopped as quickly as it started. I told myself it was probably an animal. This was the woods, after all. I rolled over and eventually fell back asleep. When I woke up again, it was because Mark was shaking my shoulder. The sun was just starting to come up, and the inside of the tent was dim, but I could see the look on his face. He looked uneasy. "Chris isn't here," he whispered. That woke me up completely. I sat up and looked over at where Chris had been sleeping. His sleeping bag was unzipped and empty, his boots gone. I figured maybe he'd just gotten up early and gone to the stream, but Mark's expression made me pause. We got out of the tent and found Julia and Mia already up. They were standing near the fire pit, which Julia had started again. Both of them looked worried. Julia was holding her arms around herself, and Mia was pacing. "Chris isn't here," Julia said, her voice low. "We've been calling for him." The woods felt different in the morning light. The trees that had seemed comforting the night before now felt too close, too thick. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy. We all started calling Chris's name, walking in different directions but staying within earshot of each other. There was no answer. After about 15 minutes of searching, Mia called out for us to come to the edge of the campsite, near the tree line. Her voice had a strange tone to it, and I felt my stomach twist as I jogged over to where she was standing. She pointed at the ground. At first, I didn't see what she was looking at, but then I noticed the disturbed dirt and leaves. There were marks, faint but clear enough to tell something had happened. The dirt was scuffed up like there had been a struggle, and there were deep impressions in the ground where someone had fallen or been dragged. And then there was something else. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was small, just a strip, but it was the same color as the jacket Chris had been wearing. No one said anything for a moment. We just stared at the ground and the torn fabric, the reality of it sinking in. Something had happened to Chris. He hadn't just wandered off. Mark broke the silence first, saying we needed to look farther into the woods. I could tell he was trying to sound confident, but his voice was shaking. We split up into pairs, Mark and me going one way and Julia and Mia going another. We didn't go far, just enough to scan the area around the campsite. None of us wanted to go too deep into the woods. As we searched, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching us. Every sound of the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig made my heart race. The woods were too quiet. There should have been birds, insects, something, but there was nothing. Just us. After about an hour, we regrouped back at the campsite. No one had found anything. No tracks, no sign of Chris. We were all tense, speaking in short, clipped sentences. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The sense of fun and adventure was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear we didn't want to admit out loud. Mia wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Mark argued that we couldn't just leave Chris behind. Julia agreed, but her voice wavered when she spoke. None of us knew what to do. We didn't have cell service out here, and the nearest town was miles away. It felt like we were completely cut off. As we debated, a sound broke through the silence, the sharp crack of a branch snapping. It came from somewhere just beyond the tree line. All four of us froze, our eyes darting toward the direction of the sound. "Chris!" Mark called out, his voice loud and shaky. There was no answer. We waited, holding our breath, but the woods stayed silent. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Mia grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark looked torn, his gaze shifting between the woods and the rest of us. Finally, he nodded. "Let's pack up. Now!" We moved quickly, throwing our gear into our backpacks with shaking hands. The whole time, I felt like something was watching us, hidden just out of sight. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see someone or something step out. But there was nothing. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, none of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, weighed down by the fear we couldn't shake. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises behind us, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees. When we finally reached the cars, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made me dizzy. We threw our packs into the trunks and got in, locking the doors. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. We reported Chris missing as soon as we reached town. Search teams were sent out, but they never found him. The official story was that he must have gotten lost in the woods, but none of us believed that. Not after what we saw at the campsite. Not after hearing that sound. I don't know what happened to Chris that night, but I still think about it. About the torn fabric. About the marks on the ground. About how close we must have been to whatever or whoever took him. When I first found the spot, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was a clearing near a small stream, tucked away in the woods about a mile from the nearest trail. It wasn't marked on any maps I had, and it felt like it had been untouched for years. The place was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and far from anyone else. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, built a small fire ring with stones, and laid out my gear. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon exploring the area, following the stream upstream until the terrain got too rough, then doubling back. I didn't see a single person or any sign that anyone had been there recently. Just the way I liked it. By the time evening rolled around, I was tired but content. I cooked a quick meal over the fire and watched the sun dip below the trees before crawling into my tent for the night. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping on the tent. It wasn't heavy, just a light drizzle, but it made everything damp and a little colder than I'd hoped. I spent most of the morning huddled near the fire, drinking coffee and reading a book I'd brought along. When the rain let up around noon, I decided to stretch my legs and explore some more. I hadn't gone far, maybe 100 yards from camp, when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a tree stump, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. It was a trail camera, strapped to a tree, aimed directly at my campsite. The sight of it made my stomach drop. It hadn't been there the day before, I was sure of it. I'd walked this same area when I was setting up camp, and I would have noticed something like that. The camera was one of those compact ones with camouflage casing, the kind hunters or wildlife researchers use. Its lens was pointed straight at the clearing where my tent stood. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who had put it there? And why? My first thought was that maybe it was left by a hunter, but it didn't make sense. It was aimed too precisely at my camp. Not at a game trail or a clearing where animals might wander through at me. I looked around, scanning the woods for any sign of someone watching. The trees were thick, the undergrowth dense, but I didn't see anyone. The woods were silent except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I walked back to the camera and stared at it again. I considered taking it down or smashing it, but something stopped me. If someone was watching, would they get angry? Would they come back to check on it and find me here? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to leave it alone for now and head back to camp. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably nothing. Maybe it had been there the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got back to camp, I tried to distract myself by packing up some of my gear and tidying up. The clearing felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat and more like a stage with a spotlight on it. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting someone to step out at any moment. By the time evening came, I was on edge. I didn't bother starting a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Instead, I ate some cold food from my pack and sat in the tent, listening to the woods. The rain had started again, heavier this time, and the sound of it hitting the tent drowned out everything else. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard it. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but it was there, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the wet undergrowth. They were coming from the direction of the trail camera. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I grabbed the small pocket knife I kept in my pack, not that it would do much good, and held it tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breathing shallow and ragged. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of something being adjusted. A click, like a latch being undone, followed by the faint rustle of fabric or plastic. They were doing something to the camera. I didn't dare move or make a sound. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, heading back the way they'd come. I waited until the sound faded completely before I let myself breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the tent, listening to every sound, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch. The rain eventually stopped, leaving the woods eerily quiet. When dawn finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I passed by the tree where the camera had been. It was gone. Whoever had put it there had taken it during the night. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, and I don't want to find out. I haven't been camping since. The woods don't feel the same anymore. They don't feel safe. We had set up camp late that afternoon, just before the sun started to dip below the ridge. It was me, my brother Will, and two of our friends, Jake and Brian. We picked a spot near a small lake at the edge of the forest, a place we camped at before. It was quiet, peaceful. We liked it because it felt far from everything, even though the trailhead wasn't more than a 2-hour hike away. We spent the evening like we always did, joking around, cooking dinner over the fire, and talking about nothing in particular. It was cool but not too cold, and the sky was clear. You could see every star. After we ate, Brian pulled out a flask, and we passed it around while the fire crackled. It wasn't until sometime after 10 that Jake noticed the other fire. "Hey," he said, his voice low, like he didn't want to draw too much attention. "Was that there before?" We all looked where he was pointing. Across the lake, maybe 300 yards away, a faint orange glow flickered through the trees. It was definitely a fire. "No way," Will said. "I didn't see it earlier." "Me neither," I said. "I think I would have noticed." It was strange. The lake wasn't huge, but it was big enough that we'd have seen someone setting up camp on the other side. And it wasn't like it was a popular spot. In all the times we'd been there, we'd never run into anyone else. "Maybe someone showed up after dark," Brian said, though he didn't sound convinced. We sat there, staring at the fire. It didn't seem to be moving, like whoever had made it was just sitting there, not doing much of anything. "You think we should go check it out?" Jake asked. "What, now?" Will said. "It's late. Let's just leave it. Whoever it is, they're not bothering us." That made sense, but it still didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt off. Maybe it was the fact that we hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, or maybe it was just the way the fire seemed so still. We tried to go back to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. Every few minutes, one of us would glance across the lake, like we were expecting something to happen. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The fire across the lake was still burning as we put out our own and headed to our tents. I lay there in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest and wondering who was out there. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the sun was rising. I crawled out of my tent and stretched, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The others were still asleep, so I walked down to the lake to wash up. That's when I saw it. The fire across the lake was gone. Not just out, completely gone. There wasn't even any smoke rising from the spot where it had been. I stared at the empty shoreline, my stomach sinking. "Hey!" I called back toward camp. "You guys need to see this." A few minutes later, they were all standing next to me, looking across the lake. "That's weird," Jake said. "It was definitely there last night, right?" We all agreed. There was no way we'd imagined it. "Maybe they packed up and left early," Brian suggested, though he didn't sound too sure. "I want to see where it was," I said. "Come on." We grabbed our stuff and walked around the edge of the lake. It took about 20 minutes to reach the spot where we'd seen the fire. As we got closer, I felt a growing sense of unease. When we reached it, my unease turned to dread. There was no sign of a campsite. No fire ring, no ashes, no footprints, nothing. The ground was damp from the morning dew, and it didn't look like anyone had been there at all. "What the hell?" Will said, his voice shaky. "Maybe we got the spot wrong," Brian said, but he didn't sound convinced. "This was it," I said. "I'm sure of it." We stood there for a while, looking around, but there was nothing to find. Eventually, we gave up and headed back to our camp. When we got there, we stopped dead in our tracks. Our campsite was wrecked. Our tents were still there, but everything else, our backpacks, our cooking gear, even our boots, had been moved. It was all arranged in a circle around a small, burned-out fire pit that hadn't been there the night before. None of us spoke for a long time. We just stood there, staring at the mess. "Who the hell did this?" Jake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked around, my heart pounding. The woods felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. "We need to get out of here," Will said. We scrambled to gather our things. Some of our stuff was wet from the dew, but we didn't care. We just wanted to leave. As we packed up, I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see someone watching us. We hiked back to the trailhead as fast as we could, not stopping to rest. The whole way, I felt like we were being followed, though I never saw or heard anything. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the words scratched into the driver's side door. "Keep out." We didn't stick around to think about it. We just got in and drove. I don't know who was out there with us, or why they did what they did. All I know is that I'm never going back to that lake. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike. I'd been planning it for weeks, carefully picking a trail I knew wasn't too crowded but still had enough markers that I wouldn't get lost. I packed everything I needed: food, gear, and my water reservoir, which I triple-checked before leaving. The hike out to the campsite was perfect. The weather was clear, the air crisp. I didn't see another person the whole way, and for once, I didn't mind. It was peaceful, just me and the sounds of the forest. I reached the spot I'd picked out a little before sunset, a flat clearing near a small stream. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and sat outside watching the stars come out. When the temperature dropped, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I felt ready to tackle the hike back. I packed up camp quickly, not wanting to waste daylight. I took a sip from my water reservoir before zipping it into my pack, and everything seemed fine. The stream nearby was clear, so I refilled my backup bottle just in case and started on the trail. It wasn't until late morning that I noticed something was wrong. I stopped to take a drink and realized the water tasted off. At first, I thought maybe it was the plastic from the reservoir, but I'd never had that problem before. I took another sip, and this time, the taste was stronger, almost metallic. I stopped walking and took the reservoir out of my pack to inspect it. The water looked fine, but the smell hit me as soon as I opened it. It was chemical, sharp, like something you'd use to clean a bathroom. I dumped it out immediately, my heart pounding. I didn't understand. I'd filled the reservoir that morning from the same stream I'd used the night before, and I'd used a filter both times. I checked my backup bottle, and that's when the panic really set in. The water in the bottle had the same smell. I didn't know what to do. I was miles from the trailhead, and the sun was getting higher. It was hot, and I'd already been hiking for a couple of hours. I'd planned my water carefully, and now I didn't have any that was safe to drink. I thought about turning back to the stream near the campsite, but the idea made me nervous. What if there was something in the water there? Or worse, what if someone was there? The thought came out of nowhere, but once I had it, I couldn't shake it. I tried to push it away. Who would do something like this? But the reservoir and bottle were fine the night before. I was sure of it. I decided to keep going. The trail was supposed to follow another stream a few miles ahead, and I figured I'd try again there. The hike felt different now. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the second stream, I was sweating and lightheaded. I crouched by the water, my filter in hand, but I hesitated. The water looked fine, but what if it wasn't? What if the problem wasn't the water at all? I forced myself to filter some and took a small sip. It tasted normal, but I couldn't bring myself to drink more. The memory of the smell from my reservoir was still too strong. I filled my backup bottle and packed it away, deciding I'd only drink if I absolutely had to. I kept walking, trying to focus on the trail ahead and not the growing sense of dread in my chest. The trail started to climb, winding up a steep hill. I was struggling by then, my legs shaking from dehydration. I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. At the top of the hill, where the trail curved, there was a pile of rocks stacked in a way that wasn't natural. It was small, maybe a foot tall, but it stood out. I froze, staring at it. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in. Slowly, I walked closer. My mouth was dry, and not just from the lack of water. When I reached the rocks, I saw something sticking out from between them. A piece of paper, folded and tucked into the pile. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before pulling it out. The paper was damp and smudged, but I could still read the writing. Not safe. That was all it said. I dropped the paper and stumbled back, looking around wildly. The forest was silent, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I felt exposed, like whoever had left the note was watching me. My mind raced. Did they mean the water wasn't safe? Or was it something else? I didn't wait to find out. I started moving, faster now, even though my legs felt like they were going to give out. I don't know how long I walked like that, my head spinning and my throat burning. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was barely holding it together. My car was the only one in the parking lot, just as it had been when I'd arrived. I climbed in and locked the doors, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the note or the water. I still don't know what happened out there, or who tampered with my supplies. All I know is that I've never felt safe in the woods since. I thought it would be a quiet weekend away from everything. My partner and I had been planning the trip for weeks, just a simple camping trip in a state park we visited before. It wasn't peak season, so we expected it to be pretty empty. That was the appeal. We got there early Friday afternoon, picked a site close to the tree line, and set up our tent. The air was crisp, and the park was quiet. There were maybe 2 other cars in the lot, but we didn't see anyone else. It felt like we had the place to ourselves. By the time we'd started dinner over the fire, the sun was setting, and the woods around us grew darker. It was peaceful, just the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional rustle in the bushes. We were sitting there talking when we heard footsteps on the gravel path leading to our site. A man walked into the light of the fire. He was dressed in a ranger's uniform, green pants, brown shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried a clipboard in one hand. He looked official enough, but there was something off about him. His uniform was clean but didn't seem to fit him right, like it was too big in some places and too tight in others. His boots were scuffed but not in a way that made sense for someone who'd been out in the woods all day. "Evening," he said, his voice calm and low. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Routine check." I glanced at my partner, who shrugged. It didn't seem out of the ordinary, park rangers sometimes check permits or make sure you're following the rules. Sure, I said, trying to sound casual. He asked where we were from, how long we planned to stay, and if we had the proper permits. We showed him the printed reservation confirmation, which he barely glanced at before nodding. Then he started asking about our gear, what kind of tent we had, how much food we brought, if we had a way to lock it up. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The questions didn't seem relevant, especially the ones about our supplies. It felt like he was sizing us up. He lingered, glancing at our tent, the cooler by the fire, and the car parked nearby. "You're pretty far back here," he said, almost like he was thinking out loud. "Not many people around this time of year." "We like the quiet," my partner said, trying to make light of it. The man nodded slowly, then made a mark on his clipboard. "Well, you folks enjoy your evening. Weather's supposed to be clear. Just remember, if you need anything, the ranger station is about a mile down the main trail." He didn't smile or say goodbye, just turned and walked back the way he came. We watched him disappear into the darkness, his footsteps fading until it was quiet again. Something about the encounter stuck with me. I told myself it was just the way he looked at our things, or maybe the way he phrased his questions. My partner brushed it off, saying he was probably just doing his job. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the tent made me sit up and listen, convinced I'd hear footsteps again. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, we decided to hike to the ranger station, partly to confirm what he'd said and partly to see if it would ease my mind. We followed the main trail, but when we got to the spot where the station should have been, there was nothing there. No building, no sign, nothing. I thought maybe we'd taken a wrong turn, but my partner pulled up the park map on their phone. We were in the right place. We decided to walk back to the car and check with the park office near the entrance. When we got there, I asked about the ranger who'd visited our site. The woman at the desk frowned. "There's no ranger on duty in that area this weekend," she said. I felt my stomach drop. "Are you sure?" He had a uniform, a clipboard. She shook her head. "We don't have anyone scheduled for that section. It's the off-season, so we're running a smaller staff." "Are you sure it was a ranger?" I didn't know how to respond. I described him, but she didn't seem to recognize the description. She said she'd make a note of it, but there wasn't much else she could do. We left the office and sat in the car for a while, trying to process what had happened. My partner suggested it could have been someone impersonating a ranger, but that only made it worse. Why would someone do that? We decided to pack up and leave. The thought of spending another night out there, knowing someone had been watching us, was too much. When we got back to the campsite, everything seemed normal at first. But as we started packing, I noticed something was missing: our food cooler. It had been sitting by the fire pit the night before, but now it was gone. The ground was wet from dew, and I could see faint footprints leading away from the site, into the woods. I didn't want to follow them. We packed up as quickly as we could and left. On the drive home, I kept replaying the encounter in my head. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but the way he looked at our things, the way he said we were far back and alone, it felt like a warning. I haven't been camping since. We thought it was going to be a good trip. The four of us, me, my girlfriend Kayla, and our friends Steve and Rachel, had planned it for weeks. We wanted to get away, somewhere quiet. No cell service, no work, no distractions. Just us in the woods. We picked a remote spot in a national forest, about a 2-hour hike from the parking area. We packed everything carefully: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, and a first aid kit. We even brought a satellite phone for emergencies, though we all agreed we wouldn't use it unless we had to. It wasn't about staying connected. It was about disconnecting. The first day was perfect. We reached the campsite in the afternoon, set up our tents, and had a fire going before sunset. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle in the trees. We joked, we ate, and we stayed up late talking. It felt like we were the only people in the world. The trouble started the next morning. I was the first to wake up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold air, planning to start the fire again. But something felt off immediately. The campsite was too empty. The cooler, which we'd left near the fire pit, was gone. So was the bag with our snacks and cooking gear. At first, I thought maybe an animal had dragged it off. But when I looked closer, I didn't see any signs of that. No torn wrappers, no scattered cans. It was just gone, like someone had picked it up and walked away with it. I woke the others. They didn't believe me at first, but when we checked around the campsite, we realized it wasn't just the food that was missing. Kayla's small backpack, which had our first aid kit and some personal items, was gone too. And so was the satellite phone. We all stood there, staring at each other. It didn't make sense. None of us had heard anything during the night, and there were no obvious signs that anyone else had been around. But the fact was, someone had taken our stuff. We decided to split up and look around. Steve and I went one way, and Kayla and Rachel went another, agreeing to meet back in an hour. Steve and I followed a narrow path leading away from the campsite. It was overgrown and hard to navigate, but we figured it was as good a place as any to start. About 20 minutes in, we found something strange. A single can of soup, sitting upright in the middle of the trail. It was one of ours. I recognized the brand. But why would someone leave it there? It felt like a breadcrumb, but we didn't know if we should follow it. We turned back, uneasy. When we got back to the campsite, Kayla and Rachel were already there. They hadn't found anything except for some flattened grass near the edge of the site, like someone had been standing there, watching. We tried to stay calm. We still had some supplies: water bottles, a couple of energy bars we'd kept in our tents, and our sleeping gear. But the realization that someone had taken our food and the satellite phone made everything feel different. We weren't alone out here, and whoever was out there didn't want us to leave easily. The rest of the day was tense. We stayed close together, taking turns keeping watch while the others rested. As the sun went down, the forest seemed to close in around us. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. That night, none of us slept much. Around midnight, we heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. We didn't have a flashlight, one of the things that had been taken, so we sat in the dark, gripping the camping knives we had brought for food prep. The footsteps stopped after a while, but the damage was done. We were too scared to stay in the tents, so we sat around the cold fire pit, whispering about what to do. By morning, we decided to leave. We still had water and enough energy to make it back to the parking area. We packed up what little we had left and started walking. About an hour into the hike, we found something that made my stomach turn. Another one of our food items, a granola bar, this time sitting in the middle of the trail. Like the can of soup, it was perfectly placed, almost inviting us to take it. We didn't touch it. We didn't even stop. We just kept walking, faster now, our eyes darting to the trees on either side of the trail. I kept feeling like someone was watching us, but every time I turned around, the path was empty. Then we heard it. A snapping branch, close by. Too close. We froze, listening. The sound came again, from the right side of the trail. Kayla grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. Steve and Rachel were ahead of us, and Steve motioned for us to keep moving. But before we could, a man stepped out from behind a tree. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His face was pale, and he didn't say anything. He just stood there, blocking the trail. In his hand, he held a long hunting knife. None of us moved. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. "Turn around," the man said, his voice low and flat. "Go back to your camp." Steve stepped forward, holding his own knife, though it looked laughably small compared to the man's. "We're leaving," Steve said. "We're going to the parking lot." The man tilted his head, like he was considering this. Then he smiled. "No, you're not." That's when Rachel screamed. Another man had appeared behind us, cutting off our escape. He was holding a machete, and his face was just as pale and expressionless as the first man's. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen, but it felt like forever. Then Kayla whispered, "Run." We bolted off the trail, into the trees. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I could hear the men shouting behind us, their footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. Eventually, we stumbled into a dry creek bed and followed it, hoping it would lead us somewhere safe. The shouting faded, but we didn't stop. We just kept going, even when my legs felt like they were going to give out. By some miracle, we found the parking area. Our car was still there, and we piled in, locking the doors and peeling out onto the road. None of us spoke until we were miles away. We reported it to the park authorities, but they didn't seem surprised. Apparently, there had been other incidents in the area, campers reporting stolen supplies or strange encounters, but nothing had ever come of it. We were lucky to get out. I don't know what those men wanted, and I don't want to think about what would have happened if we hadn't run. All I know is that I'll never go camping again. I went out to the woods for some time alone, just me and the quiet. I wanted to get away from everything. I picked a spot I'd been to a couple of times before, about 6 miles from the trailhead. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was flat, had a fire ring, and was close to a creek. Perfect for a couple of nights of peace. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a quick dinner. The weather was good, cool enough for a jacket but not cold. As the sun went down, I sat by the fire and listened to the forest. It was nice. Just what I needed. It was the next morning when things got strange. I woke up early, like always, and was sitting by the fire with a cup of instant coffee when I heard someone coming up the trail. The sound of footsteps wasn't too unusual, even out there, but what caught my attention was how fast they were moving, almost like they were running. I stood up as the guy came into view. He looked normal enough, maybe mid-30s, dressed for hiking, with a big pack on his back. But there was something about the way he was moving that made me uneasy, like he wasn't just out for a stroll. "Morning," he said, stopping at the edge of my camp. His voice was too cheerful for someone who looked like they'd been running. "Morning," I said back, keeping my tone neutral. "You all right?" "Yeah, just needed a break," he said, gesturing to my fire. "Mind if I sit for a bit?" I didn't really want him to, but it felt rude to say no. I nodded, and he dropped his pack and sat across from me. He didn't even ask for coffee, just helped himself to the pot I'd left on a rock near the fire. That annoyed me, but I didn't say anything. We made small talk for a while. His name was Mike. He said he'd been hiking the trails around the area for years and was just passing through. He seemed friendly enough, but something about him still felt off. He kept looking around, like he was checking for something, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. After about 20 minutes, I figured he'd move on. But instead, he said, "This is a nice spot. Mind if I camp here tonight?" I hesitated. I didn't want company. That was the whole point of coming out here. But I also didn't want to start a conflict with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. So I shrugged and said, "Sure, if you want." He grinned like I'd just done him a huge favor. "Great. I'll set up over there," he said, pointing to a patch of grass a few yards from my tent. The rest of the day was uncomfortable. Mike talked a lot, asking me questions about why I was out there, what I did for work, where I lived. I kept my answers short, trying not to give away too much. When I asked him similar questions, he was vague. He said he worked odd jobs and didn't really have a home base. He didn't seem to notice or care that I wasn't thrilled about him being there. As the day went on, he started acting like we were camping together, not just sharing a site. He used my gear without asking and even took one of my water bottles without saying a word. When I tried to bring it up, he brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I decided to eat a quick dinner and call it a night, hoping he'd leave in the morning. But as I was cleaning up, Mike said, "You should let me handle the fire. You didn't build it right." His tone wasn't friendly anymore. It was sharp, almost like he was scolding me. I didn't want to argue, so I let him mess with it while I went to my tent. I zipped it up and tried to relax, but I couldn't. I could hear him moving around outside, mumbling to himself. Hours passed. I was just starting to drift off when I heard him say my name. Quiet at first, then louder. "Hey, come out here. We need to talk." I didn't move. My heart was pounding. I didn't know how he even knew my name. I hadn't told him. "Come on," he said again, his voice closer now. "I know you're awake." I stayed still, hoping he'd give up. But then I heard him messing with the zipper on my tent. That's when I snapped. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, sitting up. Mike didn't flinch. "We need to talk," he said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "You're being weird." "I don't like it." "I'm being weird?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're the one unzipping my tent in the middle of the night." He just stared at me, his face calm but his eyes wild. "I don't think you get it. We're out here together. We're supposed to watch each other's backs. You're acting like you don't trust me." I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. "You need to start acting right," he said, stepping back from the tent. "I'm serious." He went back to his spot by the fire, but I didn't sleep after that. I kept my knife in my hand and stayed alert, listening for any sound. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, ignoring Mike's questions about where I was going. "You're really just gonna bail?" he said, standing over me. "That's messed up." "I need to get back," I said, keeping my voice firm. "Thanks for the company, but I'm heading out." He didn't move. He just stood there, blocking my path. "You're not leaving," he said. "Not yet." My stomach turned. I tightened my grip on my pack and said, "Get out of my way." For a second, I thought he might swing at me. But then he laughed, a short, bitter sound, and stepped aside. "Fine," he said. "Go. See if I care." I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I started walking, my heart racing, and didn't look back until I was well away from the site. Even then, I felt like he was following me. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch made me jump. It wasn't until I reached the parking area and saw other hikers that I felt safe again. I don't know what Mike's deal was, and I don't want to know. All I know is I'll never go camping alone again. I didn't think it would be anything serious. Just a weekend camping trip with a few friends. We'd gone to the same spot a couple of times before, remote, quiet, and far enough from the usual crowds that it felt like we had the whole place to ourselves. I'd always loved the woods. The peace, the stillness. It was my escape, my reset button. The first day was just like any other. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening talking and joking around. Nothing unusual. The night was cool but comfortable, and after the fire died down, we all settled into our tents. I remember hearing a few animals in the distance, but nothing that seemed alarming. It was a typical night in the woods. But the next morning, when we woke up, things felt a little different. We'd all gotten up early to cook breakfast. It was still quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear every twig snap and every breeze rustle through the leaves. As we were eating, one of my friends, Danny, pointed out something strange on a nearby tree. It looked like a symbol, carved into the bark, about the size of a dinner plate. It wasn't a typical mark you'd see from the natural wear of the forest. It was too deliberate. Too clean. "Is that a symbol?" Danny asked, squinting at the tree. We all stood up and walked over to take a closer look. It was a series of lines that crisscrossed in an almost symmetrical pattern. The lines weren't deep, but they were noticeable enough. The kind of thing you'd have to work at to carve into a tree with something sharp. "I've never seen anything like it," said Sarah, another friend. She crouched down and ran her fingers along the marks. "It's definitely not just some random scratch." We stood there for a minute, unsure what to make of it. There wasn't any obvious explanation for it. None of us had done it, and none of us thought any other hikers would leave a mark like that. It didn't feel right, but it wasn't something that screamed danger either. "Maybe it's just some weird tree carving," I said, trying to brush it off. People carve things all the time. But Danny wasn't convinced. He looked around at the trees nearby. "You guys don't think there's more of them, do you?" It didn't take long for us to find more. They were scattered all around our campsite. Not on every tree, but enough that you couldn't ignore them. At first, I figured it was just a coincidence, but the further we walked, the more frequent they became. And the marks started to look different, like they were changing. Some of them were jagged, while others were smooth, almost as if the person carving them had gotten better at it. The lines became more intricate, more deliberate. The last mark we found, just past the edge of our campsite, was the most unsettling. It was carved into a massive oak tree, and this one wasn't a simple symbol. It looked like a crude face, deep, angular lines, and what could have been eyes and a mouth. A face that seemed to be staring right at us. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This isn't normal." Danny stood frozen, his eyes wide. "We should leave. Right now." I agreed, but I didn't want to show it. The air around us had shifted. It felt thicker, like something had been watching us. The woods, which had once seemed inviting and peaceful, now felt oppressive. Heavy. And the symbols, they didn't feel random anymore. We should get back to camp, I said. Maybe pack up, go somewhere else. But just as I turned to head back, I heard something. A rustling. Not the wind. Not an animal. It was too deliberate. Someone or something was moving through the brush. We all froze, listening. It came from further down the trail. A crunch of leaves. A snap of a twig. Then, silence. Did you hear that? I whispered. Danny and Sarah nodded, their faces pale. Someone's out there, Danny muttered. We didn't move for a while. The woods around us seemed to hold its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I said, we need to get back to camp. Now. We started to walk quickly, but as we did, I noticed something else. A set of fresh footprints on the dirt trail. They were wide, heavy steps, not like any of ours. And they weren't there when we first walked by. The footsteps led away from the camp, deeper into the woods. But they didn't look like they belonged to anyone hiking casually. They looked purposeful. Like someone had been walking, watching, waiting. Do you think someone's been following us? Sarah asked, her voice cracking. I don't know, I said, feeling the pit in my stomach grow. But we need to get back. We picked up the pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. It was like there was someone just out of sight, keeping pace with us. The rustling. The footsteps. It was all too close. We finally made it back to the campsite. But as we approached, we all froze in our tracks. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, except for one thing. The symbols. They were closer now. Carved into trees that hadn't had marks on them before. More importantly, they were different. They weren't just random symbols anymore. They seemed to follow a pattern, one that was starting to feel intentional. The last tree near our campsite, the one right next to the fire ring, had a symbol that was unmistakably a hand. A hand with fingers spread wide, as if reaching for something. My heart pounded in my chest. We need to leave. Now, I said, my voice hoarse. But before I could say anything else, I heard it again, the rustling, just off the edge of the camp. And this time, I could see something moving. It was too much. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Get the gear. We're leaving. We didn't hesitate. We grabbed what we could, sleeping bags, food, anything we could carry, and we ran. As we scrambled to pack everything, I couldn't help but glance back at the trees. I swear I saw a figure, standing just beyond the firelight, watching us. It was gone as soon as I looked directly at it. We didn't stop until we reached the car, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We didn't talk much on the way back, but the silence between us was enough. The woods, the symbols, the footprints, all of it had felt like a warning. A warning that someone or something had been watching us. The next day, we reported what happened to the ranger station. They took our details, but when we asked about the symbols, the ranger just looked at us like we were crazy. No one else had reported anything strange. But I know what I saw. We all know what we saw. Those marks on the trees were no accident. And whatever or whoever was out there was watching us. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. A few friends and I had decided to go camping, just the 5 of us. We picked a spot deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The weather was supposed to be perfect, cool but not too cold, with clear skies and sunshine. But by the time we set up our tents, the clouds had started to gather, and by the evening, the rain had come. At first, it wasn't anything too serious. Just a light drizzle. We didn't think much of it. We made a fire, cooked some food, and talked well into the night. As the evening went on, the rain began to fall harder, but we all thought it was just a passing storm. By the time we finished eating and cleaned up, the rain had turned into something more serious. The sound of the rain hitting the tent grew louder, and the wind started picking up. It wasn't just a storm anymore. I remember lying in my tent, listening to the downpour, the rain drumming on the roof of the tent like 1,000 tiny hammers. I tried to sleep, but the noise and the way the wind howled around us made it impossible. Every so often, I could hear a tree creaking, and I wondered if one of them would fall. The storm was getting worse, but there wasn't much we could do about it. We were stuck out there. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to something worse. It was the sound of water. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but the sound grew louder. The rain wasn't just falling anymore, it was rising. I could hear the rush of water outside, and it didn't take long for the panic to set in. We were in a low-lying area, and the ground around us was starting to flood. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The rain hit me like a slap to the face. The ground was already turning into mud, and I could hear the rushing of water all around us. The stream we had crossed earlier in the day was now a fast-moving river. It had swollen up so quickly, and it was moving so violently that I knew we couldn't wait much longer. We needed to get out. I woke the others up. They were groggy and confused, but when they saw what was happening, panic set in fast. We all scrambled to gather our things, flashlights, the car keys, anything we could grab, but the rain was relentless. The floodwaters were rising quickly, and there was no way we could stay there much longer. As we made our way to higher ground, the rain got heavier. It felt like the world around us was closing in. We moved as quickly as we could, but the ground was getting slick, and the water was rising faster than we expected. At one point, I slipped and almost got swept away. My feet were moving, but the ground was so slippery it was impossible to keep my footing. "We need to go," Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible over the storm. She was panicking, her eyes wide as she scanned the water, looking for a way out. "I'm trying," I shouted back. "We just need to find somewhere safe." It was so dark, and the rain was coming down so hard that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. The others were close behind, but I could hear the rushing water all around us, and the wind howling like it wanted to tear everything apart. We reached a small rise in the ground, and we all paused, catching our breath. We were standing in what used to be a clearing, but now the water was ankle deep, swirling around our feet. We were no longer just running from the rain, we were fighting the storm and the flood. "Where's Ben?" Sarah asked suddenly, looking around. He was right behind me. I turned and looked. Ben wasn't there. I could see him just moments ago, moving quickly toward the rise, but now, nothing. I called his name, my voice drowned out by the rain and wind. "Ben. Ben." No answer. My heart began to pound. "Ben." I called again, more urgently this time. But nothing. No response. I turned to the others, panic creeping into my chest. He was right behind me. "Where is he?" "We need to keep moving," Danny said, his face pale in the dim light. "We can't stay here." "But we can't leave him," I said, my voice shaking. I couldn't believe he had disappeared. He couldn't have just vanished. He was with us seconds ago. "We need to go," Sarah repeated. "We don't have time." I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to believe that Ben was gone. But the water was rising. It was getting harder to stand. The trees around us were bending in the wind, and I could feel the earth shifting under my feet. We were running out of time. "I'll go back for him," I said, but Danny grabbed my arm, stopping me. "No, you'll get yourself killed. We need to go." It felt like everything was slipping out of control. I didn't know what to do. The storm, the flood, everything was happening so fast. We had to make a choice, stay and look for Ben, or keep moving and hope we could find safety before it was too late. We made the decision to leave. We moved as quickly as we could, but the floodwaters were rising even faster now. The mud sucked at our boots, and the ground beneath us felt like it was sliding away. We had to scramble to keep moving. Every so often, I looked back, hoping to see Ben running toward us, but he never appeared. It was hours before we finally made it to the main road. By then, the floodwaters had started to recede, but the storm was still raging. We stumbled out onto the road, exhausted, cold, and soaked to the bone. The sound of the rain pounding the earth was deafening, but at least we were out of the woods. We never found Ben. We waited for hours, hoping he would show up, but he never did. We called his phone. No answer. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the water had already begun to subside. They searched, but nothing. It's been months now. I still don't know what happened to him. The last time I saw him, he was just a few feet away, but when we turned back to look for him, he was gone. There's no explanation. Nothing made sense. We thought we were all going to make it out together, but Ben didn't. I still don't know if it was the flood that took him or something else. I keep hearing his voice in my head, calling out to me, but every time I turn around, there's nothing there. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake the image of him disappearing into the storm. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I've always enjoyed camping, hiking, being out in the woods alone. There's something peaceful about it, just being away from everything, surrounded by nature. But that day, everything went wrong, and I ended up lucky to be alive. It started like any other trip. I was alone, like I usually am, set up in a remote spot near a small lake. There's a trail that runs close to the campsite, but not many people use it. I had planned on spending 2 nights there, enjoying the peace. The weather was great, not too hot, and there was a nice breeze. I had everything I needed: tent, food, water, and some books to pass the time. The first day was perfect. I took a long walk in the morning, then spent the afternoon reading and relaxing by the water. I didn't see anyone. It was just me, the trees, and the quiet. At dusk, I started a small fire and cooked my dinner. Everything was fine. The next morning, I woke up early, made a quick breakfast, and decided to go for a longer hike. There was a ridge I'd been eyeing from the lake the day before, and I figured I'd take a look at it. I packed my day bag, grabbed my water bottle, and headed out. The trail was narrow and winding. I was maybe an hour into the hike when I heard something. At first, it sounded like footsteps. But that didn't make sense. There shouldn't be anyone out here. I stopped, listening closely. The sound stopped too. For a minute, I just stood there, waiting. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, moving through the underbrush. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking. The trail curved around a cluster of trees, and that's when I saw him. A man, maybe 100 yards away. He was crouched low, moving quickly, and had a rifle slung over his shoulder. I froze, instinct telling me to stay still. I wasn't expecting anyone out here, and the last thing I wanted was to startle him. I should have turned around right then. I should have left. But for some reason, I didn't. I stepped off the trail to give him some space, but I didn't want to leave either. I wanted to get a closer look, see if he was just passing through or if he was hunting. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe I felt safe with the distance, but whatever it was a mistake. I had moved off the trail a little further, hidden behind a group of tall bushes, just enough that I could still see him. I was crouched low, watching, when he suddenly stopped, raised his rifle, and aimed. My heart jumped into my throat. My first thought was that he saw something. Maybe an animal. I thought maybe he was hunting for something, and I was just in the way. But then everything happened too quickly. The shot rang out. My body jerked in surprise, but the pain came right after. A sharp, searing pain in my side. I gasped, my legs giving out beneath me as I collapsed. I didn't even understand what had just happened. I had no idea what to do. I felt the blood seeping through my clothes, warm and sticky. The man, I don't know how, but he must have realized what he did, came running toward me. I couldn't even process what was happening. He was muttering to himself, words I couldn't make out. Panic in his voice. He stopped in front of me and looked at me, his face pale as he stared at the wound. Shit, 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 he kept repeating. His hands were shaking. I was in shock, trying to breathe through the pain, trying to focus. But everything was spinning, and I felt so dizzy. I couldn't move. Could barely even talk. The man was still kneeling in front of me, his eyes darting around, like he was looking for something. For a second, I thought maybe he was looking for help, maybe he'd call 911. But then he stood up abruptly, his expression shifting to fear. I didn't mean to shoot you, he said, his voice high-pitched. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed. Then he took a few steps back, glancing nervously over his shoulder. And that's when he did something I will never forget. He turned and started running. Just left. Without saying another word, without trying to help, without even making sure I was still alive. He ran back down the trail, leaving me there. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't even fully process what had just happened. I remember hearing his footsteps getting farther away, and it hit me, he wasn't coming back. I was alone. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was clutch at my side and try to stop the bleeding. I didn't know how long I'd been lying there, but I knew it was getting worse. The pain wasn't going away, and I could feel the blood soaking through my clothes, my hands slippery from it. I knew I had to move. Somehow, I had to get help. But I was in the middle of nowhere. The trail was empty. There was no one else around. The man had just left me to die. Somehow, I managed to drag myself onto my feet. It was slow, and the pain was unbearable, but I kept moving. I couldn't afford to lie there. I had to find my way back to the campsite, or at least to somewhere, anywhere with people. The trail felt like it went on forever, the trees around me closing in. It was hard to keep track of time. My vision was blurry, and every step felt like it might be my last. I don't know how, but after what felt like hours, I made it back to my campsite. I collapsed by my tent, my strength finally giving out. I could barely move anymore, and everything hurt so much I couldn't focus on anything. I don't know how long it was before someone found me. When they did, it wasn't a rescue team or the police. It was just a group of hikers who happened to be in the area. They called for help, and I passed out right then. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. The bullet had grazed my ribs and had gone through my side, but I was alive. Barely. As for the man who shot me, I never heard from him again. I don't know who he was. He never contacted the authorities, never reported the accident. I'm sure he thought he'd get in trouble for what happened, but he left me there, bleeding in the woods, alone. I never went back out into the wilderness after that. I can't. The thought of being that alone again, of depending on someone who would just leave me behind, it's too much. And I don't know if I'll ever understand how someone could do that. I went camping alone up in the mountains last spring, just to get away from everything for a few days. It's something I like to do from time to time, the quiet, the solitude, the chance to just clear my mind. I'm not someone who gets nervous easily, especially not in nature. I've been on countless hikes and camping trips. So, when I set up camp at a little clearing just off the main trail, I thought it would be another peaceful night. The weather was perfect, and I was feeling good. I had a small fire going, just enough to cook my dinner and keep the bugs away. It was about dusk, and I was sitting on a log by the fire, eating some canned chili. That's when I heard footsteps. At first, I figured it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. I tensed up, standing up slowly and turning toward the noise. Out of the trees stepped a man, maybe in his mid-30s. He looked scruffy, hair long and unkempt, clothes worn and dusty, like he'd been walking for a long time. He didn't look dangerous at first, but something about the way he approached made my stomach tighten. He smiled, and I could tell it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel at ease. "Hey there," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "You got a minute?" I was hesitant but didn't want to be rude. "Sure. What's up?" "I'm just lost," he said, walking closer to my fire. "Been walking for hours, trying to find the trail again. You wouldn't happen to have a map, would you?" I glanced at the small map I had tucked in my bag and then back at him. Something felt off. His clothes were too worn for someone just out for a hike, and there was a smell to him, damp, musty, and a little like sweat. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I offered him a quick smile. "Yeah, I've got one, but I'm not sure you're too far off the trail. You should be able to find it if you head north." He nodded like he was listening, but then just stood there. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes just stayed on me, almost studying me, like he was trying to figure something out. I didn't like the way he was looking at me. It felt like he wasn't interested in finding the trail anymore, like he was waiting for me to invite him to stay. "You camping out here?" he asked, his voice much softer now, like we were having a casual conversation. I wasn't sure how to answer. The tone of his voice had shifted. He wasn't just lost anymore. He was interested in something else. "Yeah, just for a few nights." He nodded again, taking a few steps closer to the fire. Too close. I took a step back without thinking, suddenly feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't about to let some random guy get too close to me in the middle of nowhere. "You alone?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Seems kind of dangerous out here all by yourself, don't it?" I forced a smile, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's not too bad. I'm used to it." He didn't seem convinced. You ever worry someone might show up, though? Someone like me? That hit me like a cold wave, and I froze. His words hung in the air, almost like a threat disguised as a joke. I didn't know if I should laugh it off or if I should take it seriously. I decided not to engage, hoping he'd get the hint. Look, I should probably get some sleep, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's getting late. But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned against a tree, just standing there, staring at me with that same unsettling gaze. You got a tent set up, or are you just sleeping under the stars? He asked, his voice calm, but there was something in it, something almost too calm, like he was probing for more. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to keep my thoughts together, but the unease I felt was growing. I glanced at my tent, then back at him. His posture had changed. He was no longer just standing still. He was leaning in slightly, almost like he was waiting for me to say something, anything. I'm good for the night, I said, trying to sound casual. I'm just gonna get some rest. You should probably head out before it gets too dark. But he didn't leave. He just kept standing there. I could hear him shifting, like he was trying to make himself comfortable without really moving away. I tried to stay calm, but everything inside me was screaming to just get in the tent and zip myself up. The man took a step closer. You ever think about what would happen if someone didn't leave? That was it. That was the moment I realized I was dealing with someone who wasn't just lost. He wasn't just a drifter passing through. He was trying to make me feel small, make me uncomfortable, make me unsure. And in that moment, I knew I had to act. I think you should go, I said, my voice low but firm. Now. His smile didn't fade, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that made the blood in my veins freeze. For a second, he just stood there, looking at me like he was trying to decide whether to push it further. Then, without saying another word, he turned and started walking away, his footsteps slow and deliberate, almost like he was savoring the moment. As he moved further into the trees, I couldn't help but watch him, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening, and I was still holding my breath, waiting for him to turn around, to come back, too. But he didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours lying in my tent, listening to the noises around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the trees, made my heart race. I was afraid to fall asleep, afraid that he'd come back, or worse, that he'd already be waiting for me outside. At dawn, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about the hike I had planned. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove away, I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, about his words. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had known exactly what he was doing. And if I hadn't stood my ground, I don't know what might have happened. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. I can't get the image of him standing there, just watching me, out of my head. I don't think I'll ever feel safe out there again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, nothing fancy. A few friends and I, just wanting to disconnect for a bit, get away from our regular routines. We decided on a spot deep in the woods, far away from any tourist trail. There were 5 of us in total, and we were all in our mid-20s, just looking for some quiet, fresh air, and a little bit of adventure. We'd been hiking for a few hours when we stumbled upon it. The cabin. It wasn't exactly hidden, but it was definitely off the beaten path. We came across it while walking along the edge of a creek, our feet tired and our conversations dying down as we started to focus more on the hike itself. The cabin sat there, not far from the water. It was small, made of dark wood, with a roof that was clearly older than the rest of the structure. From where we were standing, it looked abandoned, dirty windows, the kind of place you'd assume hadn't been lived in for years. The moment we saw it, the thought that ran through my head was simple. It was a good place to check out for a few minutes. A nice break from the hike. "We should check it out," said Nick, the most adventurous of the group. "Could be interesting. Might even find some cool old stuff." We all agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We didn't have anything better to do, and it was still early in the afternoon, so we had plenty of time. We walked up the short trail to the front door. The porch creaked under our feet. It had that old, musty smell, a mix of rotting wood and dampness. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but I remember the air feeling colder as we got closer. Nick knocked, but no one answered. He turned the knob, and the door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for us. The first thing I noticed when we stepped inside was the silence. It was like the place hadn't been disturbed in years, but at the same time, it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't supposed to be there. The inside was just as you'd expect: old furniture, some broken chairs, a table covered in dust. But there was something off. On the far wall, there were a bunch of photographs, pinned up with crooked tacks. I stepped closer to get a better look. They weren't normal photos. There were faces, but they all had something about them, something unsettling. Some were of people I didn't recognize, but others, they looked like they were taken recently, like they'd been watching the people in the photos for longer than they should have. Nick was over by a table on the other side of the room, flipping through some papers. He muttered something under his breath, but I was too focused on the photos to catch it. I turned to see what he'd found and saw what looked like a bunch of maps. My heart skipped a beat. They were of the forest, of the area around where we were camping. And then, I saw it. Our campsite was marked on the map, along with a bunch of other little marks. Trails, paths, and locations. But what made my stomach turn was the detail. There were notes on some of the places, things like "watch" or "wait" scribbled in the margins. "Guys, you need to see this." Nick's voice pulled me away from the map. I glanced over to see him standing near a small shelf, holding something. It looked like a bundle of old documents, but the moment I saw it, my stomach sank. It was a collection of notebooks, all filled with handwritten notes. He flipped through one of them, the pages yellowed and brittle, like they hadn't been touched in years. The handwriting was shaky, erratic, almost manic. It didn't take long to realize what I was looking at. The notes were about people, different names, descriptions, and dates. Some of the names were familiar, ones I recognized from the photos on the wall, and they were marked with strange symbols. But what was worse, the notes didn't just describe these people, they seemed to track their movements, even their behaviors, like someone had been following them. There were details about where they'd been, who they'd talked to, and what they'd been doing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The whole place felt wrong now, like it was suffocating me. "Guys, this isn't just a random cabin. We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now!" But no one moved. They were all still looking at the maps and photos. It was as if they couldn't tear themselves away from it. I moved closer to the back of the cabin, where there was a door leading to what looked like a small bedroom. I felt my heart racing. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw something that made me freeze. The room wasn't just empty. It was filled with more photos, more of those faces, and along the floor, scattered around, were piles of used, crumpled up wrappers from some kind of food. But there was something more disturbing. The walls were covered in scratches, not from animals or weather, but deep gouges, as though someone had scraped at the wood with their fingernails. I backed out of the room, my breath coming quicker. I called to the others. We need to leave. Now. This place isn't safe. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Someone had been following us. A figure stood in the doorway of the cabin, just outside, barely visible against the fading light. It was too far for me to see clearly, but I could tell it was a person. My heart hammered in my chest. "Guys," I said, almost in a whisper. "Someone's out there." Nick was the first to react, pushing past me to look out the door, but by the time we all moved to the front, the figure was gone. The woods outside looked empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was like the world outside had gone silent, and the only sound was the pounding of my own heart. Without another word, we grabbed our stuff and rushed out of the cabin, not bothering to close the door behind us. We didn't even look back. We just ran. We didn't speak much, but I could tell everyone was feeling the same sense of dread. We didn't stay in the forest after that. We packed up our camp and left before nightfall, driving back to town without a word. We couldn't explain what we saw or what that place was, but we all agreed on one thing: we weren't going back there. Ever. Since that day, I haven't been able to forget what I saw in that cabin, the photographs, the maps, the notes. I don't know who was watching us, or if they were still out there, but I can't shake the feeling that someone is. And it's been months since that day, but I still can't stop thinking about that cabin and the eyes that seem to be watching us, waiting for us to leave. I still can't shake off what happened that weekend. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just a couple of days in the woods with a few friends, nothing special. A chance to get away from the hustle, enjoy some fresh air, and have a break from the usual grind. I'd been hiking a few times before, so I knew what to expect. But that weekend, it turned into something completely different. We drove up on Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. There were 5 of us: me, my brother James, his girlfriend Sarah, and 2 of our friends, Dan and Laura. We found a spot deep in the woods, far enough away from any major trails. It was quiet, peaceful, just how we wanted it. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening talking, laughing, and drinking beers. We didn't think about much, just enjoying the moment. Saturday was pretty uneventful. We hiked, explored a bit, and spent the day relaxing by the river. We had a good dinner, played some card games, and then went to bed early because we were all exhausted from the hike. The night was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence you can only get when you're far away from city noise. We fell asleep with no problems at all. But when we woke up on Sunday morning, everything felt off. The weather was fine, but there was something in the air that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it. The others didn't seem to notice, though. We packed up our things, folded the tents, and were about ready to head back to the car. That's when things started to go wrong. We had parked the car just off the main road, about a quarter of a mile from our campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing, hidden enough that we didn't worry about it being visible from the main trail. We all made our way back down the path, talking and laughing, until we came to the clearing. That's when we saw it. The car looked fine from a distance, but as we got closer, I noticed something. The tires. Every single one of them was slashed. Flat as a pancake. And as I walked around the back, I saw the engine hood was open. My heart started to race. I looked at James, who looked just as confused as I felt. "Who the hell would do this?" he muttered, walking toward the hood. I didn't know what to say. It was just wrong. Why would anyone be out here? The place we were camping wasn't exactly easy to get to. It wasn't like someone could just casually wander by. We hadn't seen anyone else on the trails the whole time we were there. It didn't make any sense. James looked under the hood, poking around. It's tampered with. Someone's been messing with the engine. There's no way this happened overnight. What do you mean? Sarah asked, her voice shaky. What do you think happened? I don't know, he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. But it's not good. I think we're stuck here. Stuck? Dan said, his voice rising. You're telling me we're stuck out here? How? We're miles from the nearest town. We can't just walk back. We all stood there, staring at the car in disbelief. I could see the panic creeping into everyone's faces. It was supposed to be a simple trip. We were supposed to drive back and enjoy the rest of the day. But now, we were stranded. And someone had clearly done this on purpose. We need to call for help, I said, trying to keep calm, even though I could feel my own nerves starting to fray. Maybe someone can come get us. Good luck with that, Laura said, holding up her phone. There's no signal out here. Remember? She was right. We hadn't had any reception since we started the hike, and now there was no way to contact anyone. It was just the 5 of us, stuck in the middle of nowhere. I paced around the car, trying to think. There had to be something we could do. But when I looked at the damage again, it became clear someone had deliberately destroyed the car. The tires were slashed clean through. The engine was messed with in a way that made it obvious it wasn't some random vandal. This was intentional. Someone wanted us stuck here. I felt the air grow heavier, like the forest around us was closing in. The peaceful getaway had turned into something darker. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of whoever had done this still being nearby. Watching us. Waiting. We need to figure out what to do, James said. We can't just sit here. We could try to hike out, I suggested. It's not far to the road. Maybe we can flag someone down, get a tow truck or something. But no one seemed too keen on that idea. It was starting to get late in the afternoon, and we were already exhausted from the hike the day before. None of us were in any condition to walk the distance, especially with the heavy feeling hanging over us. No one said it, but we all knew it. It wasn't just the car that was messed up. Something was wrong here. Someone had gone out of their way to trap us. We sat around the car for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. It felt like every second that passed, the weight of the situation just kept getting heavier. The trees around us, once just part of a nice forest, now seemed to press in closer. The whole world felt quieter, like we were being watched, even though we didn't see anything out of place. Then, just as we were starting to talk about maybe going on foot, we heard something. A noise. A branch snapping in the woods. We all froze. Everyone turned to look, their eyes wide with the same realization. We weren't alone. For what felt like forever, we stood there, barely breathing, listening. But the noise didn't come again. It could have been an animal, just the wind, or maybe a trick of the mind. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we had no way out. No way to know who or what had done this to us. We made a decision then, even though it felt impossible. We would try to walk out. Stick together. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves felt like someone was getting closer. It wasn't an easy hike out. It was a long, exhausting trek, made worse by the growing sense of fear that hung over us. But we finally made it to a place where we could get a signal on our phones, and after what felt like hours, we managed to get through to someone who could help. They showed up and towed us back to town. We didn't look back at the woods as we drove away. None of us said much during the ride. We were all just too shaken. To this day, I still don't know who did it, or why. But I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched the whole time. We got out safe, yes. But something about that weekend, it wasn't just the car. It was the feeling that we were never meant to leave. It's hard for me to even think about what happened. I still get flashes of that weekend, the way everything spiraled out of control so quickly. The woods were supposed to be a getaway, a way to unwind from the daily grind. I thought we were going to have a good time, just the 5 of us. But none of us expected the nightmare that followed. It started on the 2nd day of our camping trip. We had set up camp in a secluded area, deep in the forest, a place that wasn't too far from the nearest trail but far enough that we felt like we had some privacy. The kind of spot where you can hear only the wind and the occasional rustle of wildlife. No cell service, no distractions. We were there to get away, to relax. There was me, my friend Matt, his girlfriend Claire, and 2 others, Jake and Maria. Everyone was in a good mood that morning. We had spent the previous day hiking around, exploring, and just enjoying the peace of being out in nature. We even made a small fire, roasted some marshmallows, and had a few beers. It was nice. But things took a turn when we decided to venture into the woods to gather some wild mushrooms. Matt had done it before, and we all figured it would be a good way to add something fresh to our dinner. Claire wasn't too sure about it, but she went along with it, not wanting to be the odd one out. We wandered for maybe half an hour before Matt found some mushrooms he said were safe. He seemed pretty confident, even a little too confident. We weren't experts, but he swore by it. So we picked a decent amount, enough to cook with. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was beginning to set, and we were all hungry. We cooked up what we gathered with the rest of the food we brought. It wasn't long after we ate that things started to go south. At first, it was subtle. Claire mentioned feeling a little off, but she chalked it up to the hike. Jake seemed a little more tired than usual, but we figured it was from the heat. Matt was fine, or so he claimed. But then, about an hour later, Maria suddenly doubled over, clutching her stomach. Her face went pale, and her breathing started to come in sharp gasps. We all rushed her, asking if she was okay, but she could barely answer. She was sweating, her body stiff and trembling. I couldn't tell what was going on. She wasn't drunk. She wasn't allergic to anything, at least as far as we knew. But she kept muttering that she felt wrong. That something was wrong inside her. At first, we thought it might have been a stomach bug, or maybe she ate something that didn't sit right with her. But as time went on, her condition worsened. She wasn't just nauseous, she was shaking uncontrollably. Her skin started to flush red, and her eyes became unfocused. By then, Claire was panicking, trying to get a signal on her phone to call for help, but there was nothing. No bars. We were stuck. We tried to make her comfortable, but nothing helped. We gave her water, hoping it would settle her stomach, but it just made things worse. She started vomiting, and then she collapsed. That was when we realized just how serious it was. It felt like the air around us had thickened, the reality of the situation sinking in. She wasn't getting better. She was getting worse. I remember trying to calm Claire down, telling her everything would be fine, but I didn't know what to do either. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town. No phone signal, no way to get help. It was like a nightmare that had become real. We knew we had to do something. The only thing we could think of was to get help, but we had no idea who to trust. Matt insisted it was the mushrooms. He started muttering about how some of them could be poisonous if you weren't careful. He had eaten them, too, but he didn't seem as bad. Still, his face was pale, and he looked nauseous. Claire wanted to leave and try to find help, but we didn't know the way. And we couldn't just leave Maria like this. We were stuck. We had a long conversation, trying to figure out who could leave and who should stay behind with Maria. But every time we talked about it, the situation seemed more and more dire. No one wanted to leave her. No one wanted to risk it. but we also couldn't just stay there and do nothing. We were all scared. Everyone was scared. Matt eventually volunteered. He said he could handle it, that he was the only one who knew the way back to the trail. The rest of us were in no condition to hike out. Maria was in no shape to move, and Jake and Claire were both starting to show signs of nausea too. I wasn't feeling great myself, but I was functional. Barely. I remember Matt leaving with a small pack of supplies. He said he would be back as quickly as he could, but none of us believed him. We all knew the forest was vast, and the nearest town was over 20 miles away. Even if he made it to the trail, it would take hours for him to get help, and that was if he didn't get lost or collapse along the way. Hours passed. We sat by the fire, the sounds of the woods creeping in around us, the stillness broken only by Maria's labored breathing. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every time the wind rustled the trees, we thought it might be Matt coming back. But it wasn't. It never was. By the time morning came, we were all on edge. Maria was still out of it, barely conscious. The rest of us were exhausted, too sick to move properly. I checked her pulse and tried to keep her warm, but she was slipping. It was like she wasn't even there anymore, her body limp and unresponsive. I don't know how long we would have lasted if Matt hadn't come back. When he did, he was almost unrecognizable. His face was drawn, his eyes wild, and his movements were shaky. He said he'd found a cabin on the edge of the forest and managed to get to a phone. Help was on the way. But even then, I could tell something was off. He looked pale, his hands trembling. The rescue team arrived a few hours later. They took Maria and the rest of us back to the town. By then, we were all feeling better, though none of us were sure if we could trust what had happened. Maria had to stay in the hospital for a few days to recover, but she made it. We never did figure out exactly what happened, what had caused the poisoning, or if it was the mushrooms at all. We never went back to that place. I still don't know what Matt saw or did out there, but I don't want to know. Whatever happened, it was close. Too close. I've thought about telling this story for a while now, but every time I try, I can't quite get the words right. I'm not a writer, and I don't think I ever will be. But I feel like I have to get it out. Someone should know what happened. What I saw. What I felt. I went camping with a few friends last summer. It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing fancy. A weekend to unwind in the mountains, escape the noise of the city. We set up camp near a river, not too far from a well-known trail, but far enough that we wouldn't have to deal with other hikers. Everything seemed perfect at first. The weather was nice, the air was fresh, and the only sounds were the river and the birds. We had a good time. A few hikes, some fishing, a campfire. It was nice. But on the third day, things started to go wrong. We had planned to go for a long hike. The others wanted to explore a bit further, up into the hills. I didn't want to go at first, but I decided to tag along. I figured it would be nice to get away from the camp for a bit and stretch my legs. So we packed some water, snacks, and set off early in the morning. The hike was more difficult than I expected. The path wasn't as clear as I thought it would be, and the terrain got rough pretty quickly. But the view was beautiful. We stopped at a few overlooks, took some pictures, and then started heading back down. I didn't think it would be that hard to find our way back to camp. But by the time we turned around to head back, I realized I had gotten turned around. I wasn't sure which direction we had come from. I thought I remembered the trail, but everything started to look the same. I didn't want to admit I was lost, so I kept walking, thinking I'd find the way back soon enough. The others were ahead of me, but I wasn't too worried. I thought I'd catch up. The deeper into the woods I went, the more everything seemed unfamiliar. The path was less visible now, overgrown in spots, and I couldn't hear the river anymore. I stopped and tried to get my bearings, but I couldn't make out anything that looked familiar. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I kept going. After what felt like hours, I noticed something strange. There was a small clearing ahead. The ground was trampled, the grass bent, and there were footprints. They didn't look like animal prints. They were too large, too uneven. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A pile of broken branches, stacked in a way that didn't seem natural. It looked like someone had been trying to build something, but there was no sign of anyone around. I felt a knot form in my stomach, and I tried to turn around, but that's when I heard it. A rustling sound, like someone was moving through the trees. It was faint, but it was there. My heart started to race, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no one else on the trail. I knew that. I hadn't seen anyone else the whole time we've been out here. And yet, I could feel something watching me. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, but it felt like the woods were closing in on me. The rustling grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Complete silence. I didn't wait around to figure out what it was. I turned and started running, hoping to find the trail again. The panic started to settle in. I was lost, and I didn't know which way to go. I kept running, but it felt like the trees were getting thicker, like they were deliberately blocking my path. I could feel my chest tightening, and my legs were starting to give out. I had to stop for a minute, catch my breath. That's when I noticed something else. There were markings on the trees. At first, I thought they were just scratches, maybe from animals, but the more I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were deliberate. A series of notches, almost like someone was marking their territory. But it didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. Not this deep in the woods. Not this far from the trail. I was about to turn around when I heard a voice. It was quiet at first, barely a whisper, like someone calling my name. But it wasn't anyone I recognized. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice didn't sound friendly. It sounded urgent, like it didn't want me to leave. I started to back away, but the ground under me shifted, and I lost my balance. I fell, landing hard on the ground. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. A man. He was standing between the trees, watching me. He was tall, but he wasn't moving. I couldn't make out his face clearly. It was covered in shadow, but I could tell he was staring at me. It was like he had been waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. My whole body went rigid, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he disappeared into the trees. Vanished. Like he wasn't even there. I stayed frozen on the ground for a long time, trying to process what just happened. Was he real? Or was it my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know. But I didn't care. I wasn't staying to find out. I got up as fast as I could and started running again. I didn't stop until I found the trail. By the time I made it back to camp, I was exhausted, covered in sweat, and my mind was racing. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not right away. I couldn't bring myself to say it. It was too insane, too unreal. But that night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't sleep much. Every noise in the woods felt like a threat, and I kept expecting to see that man again. I didn't say anything to the others. They were just glad to see me back. We left the next day. I didn't tell them about the figure I saw or the strange markings on the trees. I couldn't. I didn't want to make it worse. But I still think about it. The man in the woods. The feeling of being watched. The strange markings. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I never want to find out again. I've been trying to put this into words for months now, but every time I start, I can't seem to get it right. I still don't know exactly what happened, but I know what I saw and what I felt. It's not something I'll ever forget. It started like any other camping trip. A couple of friends and I went to a spot we've been to before. A quiet, remote place in the woods, far enough from civilization to feel like we were in the middle of nowhere, but not too far that we'd have trouble getting out if we needed to. The weather was perfect. The campfire was warm. We spent the first day setting up, hiking around a bit, and just relaxing. It felt like a much-needed break from everything. The next morning, we decided to gather firewood. We hadn't prepared enough the night before, and we didn't want to run out by the time the sun set. So, I volunteered to go out alone. I figured it would be a good chance to stretch my legs and get some alone time. We weren't that far from camp, and I had a good idea of the area. It was just a short walk through the trees, grab a few fallen branches, and head back. I left the camp and started walking through the woods. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that only nature can have. There was a slight breeze rustling the leaves, and I could hear the distant sounds of birds, but nothing that felt out of place. I wasn't thinking about much, just enjoying the peace and the routine of it. I'd done this countless times before on camping trips, so there was no reason to be concerned. I walked for about 15 minutes, deeper than I usually did, but I had seen plenty of fallen branches along the way, and I figured it'd be easy to pick up a good amount. After gathering a few, I started turning back. That's when I heard it. A snap. A branch breaking in the distance. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make me stop in my tracks. I looked around, trying to see where it had come from, but the woods were thick, and the trees were close together. It was hard to tell if it was just an animal or something else. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I turned and started walking back, but now I was moving faster, my eyes scanning the trees. My breath started to pick up, but I tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept walking, looking over my shoulder now and then, but I didn't see anyone. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being paranoid. Then I heard footsteps. Not the quiet shuffle of an animal, but the unmistakable sound of someone walking through the woods, heavy, deliberate steps. They were getting closer. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here? There shouldn't have been anyone else. This area was remote. The chances of meeting another person were slim. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I needed to get back to camp. I turned and started running, not looking back, just focusing on the path ahead. I could hear the footsteps behind me, now quickening, almost as if they were chasing me. I felt my breath catching in my throat as I pushed myself harder, running faster than I ever had through the uneven terrain. My mind was racing, and I could feel the panic building. Suddenly, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, and I fell hard to the ground, my hands scraping against the rough earth. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, too close. My breath was coming in short, frantic gasps as I scrambled to my feet, and that's when I heard a voice. Low, almost a growl. Don't run. The voice was closer now, just a few feet behind me. I didn't wait to see who it was. I just took off again, my legs burning as I pushed through the pain, not daring to look back. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, branches reaching out like hands, trying to stop me. I could hear the footsteps still, right behind me, and then I felt it, a hand grabbing my shoulder. It yanked me backward, and I went down hard again, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. I barely had time to react before I felt the person on top of me, their weight pinning me down. I fought. I kicked, I scratched, anything to get free, but the person's grip was strong. They were trying to hold me, their hand closing around my throat, and I could feel the pressure tightening. I gasped for air, my vision starting to blur, and I thought for a second that I wasn't going to make it out of there. But then something changed. The person shifted, just for a second, and I was able to break free. I don't know how, but I managed to roll out from under them and scramble to my feet. My head was spinning, my body weak from the panic and the adrenaline, but I didn't stop. I ran again, hearing the footsteps behind me, but this time I didn't let up. I couldn't. I finally broke through the tree line, and I saw the camp in the distance. I could barely hear the footsteps anymore, but I didn't care. I kept running, pushing myself harder, until I reached the camp. I collapsed into the dirt, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked behind me, but there was no one following. I don't know how I got away, but somehow I had. I told my friends what happened as best as I could, but they didn't fully understand the fear that was still gripping me. They thought maybe I had just gotten spooked or lost my footing, but I knew what had happened. Whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen. I don't know if they were trying to rob me, hurt me, or something else, but I know I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted through those woods. We packed up and left that evening, and I never went back to that spot again. It wasn't just the fear of what had happened, there was something else. Something in the woods that day that I can't quite put into words, but I'll never forget. To this day, I don't know who or what I ran from, but I'm sure of one thing, I wasn't alone out there. Not for a second. I still can't shake the memory of what happened. It's been months now, but every time I close my eyes, I can see it all over again. The pain, the terror, the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I'm not sure I'll ever get over it. It was just supposed to be a quick camping trip, something simple, just to get away from the noise of the city for a weekend. I've always enjoyed the solitude of the woods, so when I found a quiet spot, I knew it'd be perfect. No one else around for miles, just the sounds of nature and the comfort of my tent. I set up my camp near a small stream and spent the day walking around, familiarizing myself with the area. It was about the third day when I decided to go off trail, just to explore a little. The woods were thick with trees, the ground soft underfoot, and it felt like the kind of place you could easily get lost in if you didn't know what you were doing. But I didn't mind. I wasn't going far, and I had a good sense of direction. My plan was simple: walk for a while, maybe find a nice spot for photos, and then head back. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. The underbrush started to thin out, and I could see the ground was uneven, almost like something had disturbed it recently. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals, maybe, or some weather erosion. But then, I stepped on something that didn't feel right underfoot. It was a rope, thin and tight, hidden beneath the leaves. Before I could process what was happening, the rope pulled, and I felt a sharp, brutal pain shoot up my leg. I screamed out and instinctively tried to pull away, but it was too late. The trap had already triggered. I looked down and saw that a thick metal clasp had closed around my ankle, the pressure unbearable, and I could feel something sharp digging into my skin. Blood was starting to drip, and I couldn't move. Panic flooded my chest, and I knew I had to get out of it, but my mind was racing. I looked around, but all I saw were trees, more trees. No one around. I tried to yank my foot free, but it was useless. The pain was almost too much to bear, and I could feel myself starting to lose control. What kind of trap was this? It wasn't a bear trap. The metal was thinner, more like something set for smaller animals, maybe a snare? But it was too heavy for something meant for an animal that small. And the fact that it was hidden so well made me think it wasn't just a hunting trap. I managed to calm myself enough to think, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. I wasn't going to just give up. I looked around, trying to find anything that could help me. The trap was tight, and there was no way to loosen it. But there had to be a way to get out. I realized that I needed to stay calm. The more I panicked, the more it would hurt. But the longer I stayed in that spot, the more dangerous it became. I knew I was alone out here, at least, I thought I was. The woods were vast, and I was a good distance from camp. The trap could have been set by anyone. But then it hit me. I wasn't just injured. I was alone. I had no way to get help. And there was no telling who had set the trap or if they were still nearby. I tested the trap again, trying to move my leg, but it was useless. The more I moved, the worse the pain became, and I could feel the blood pooling around my ankle. I was losing time. Whoever set this trap, they could be watching me right now. Or worse, they could be coming to finish what they started. I thought about the knife I had in my pack, just a few feet away. It wasn't the best tool for the job, but it was something. It was the only thing I had. I tried to reach for it, but every movement caused the trap to tighten even more. I gritted my teeth, determined not to give in to the pain. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to get the knife. It took what felt like hours, but finally, I managed to grab the knife from my bag. I knew it wouldn't cut the metal, but maybe I could use it to loosen the mechanism somehow. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I could think of. I struggled with it for what felt like forever, sweat pouring down my face, my breath shallow and erratic. Every second I wasted was another second closer to being completely helpless. Just as I thought I might pass out from the pain, I heard it. A snap of a twig behind me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to listen, but the forest was too quiet. I turned my head as much as I could, but I couldn't see anything. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I forced myself to stay still, praying that whoever it was wouldn't find me. I had no way of defending myself, and I knew if they saw me, there would be no way I could run. I had to focus on getting out of this trap, but I couldn't help but feel that someone was watching me. That they were getting closer. The minutes felt like hours. I kept hearing noises, footsteps, twigs breaking, but I couldn't see anyone. I knew whoever it was wasn't too far off. They had to know I was here. The feeling of being hunted, trapped like an animal, was overwhelming. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, each thump a reminder of how vulnerable I was. Finally, with a desperate move, I managed to use the knife to pry the trap open just enough to slide my foot out. The pain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I forced myself to stand, even though I could barely feel my leg. I didn't care. I stumbled forward, dragging myself away from the trap, my vision swimming from the pain. I had to get back to camp. I didn't care how, but I had to make it. I stumbled back to the path, trying to get back to camp. My ankle was bleeding, my whole body aching from the strain, but I couldn't stop. The thought that someone could be following me, watching me, made it impossible to slow down. Every step felt like a lifetime, but I kept going. Eventually, I made it back to camp, but the relief was short-lived. There was still the sick feeling that someone had been watching me, and I wasn't sure I was safe yet. I don't know who set the trap, or if they were still out there, but I didn't stay another night to find out. I packed up as quickly as I could, ignoring the pain in my leg, and drove straight back to the nearest town. It's been weeks, but I still feel like someone's watching me when I'm alone in the woods. I haven't gone back, and I don't think I ever will. It's hard to know where to begin with this. I think it's taken me so long to write this because it still feels like a bad dream. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that something went horribly wrong that day, something that could have been avoided if we just made different choices. We were all experienced hikers, at least a little, and we planned this trip for months. The idea was to camp in the mountains for a weekend, just to disconnect from everything. It was supposed to be simple. We'd done this kind of thing before, just not in this particular area. The weather had been fine the whole trip, and the first couple of days went off without a hitch. We had our laughs, we cooked our meals over a fire, and everything felt normal, almost too normal. By the third day, we were packing up to head back. It was late afternoon, and we had been moving slowly through the trails, not wanting to rush. But when we reached a certain point, one of the guys, Mark, suggested taking a shortcut. He'd been to this area a few times before, and apparently, this canyon was a faster way back to our camp. We all thought it was a good idea. We had a little time to spare, and the weather was holding up. It seemed like a quick detour that would save us some hours. None of us thought twice when Mark led the way. The canyon was narrow, with sheer rock walls on either side, but it didn't look dangerous. In fact, it looked beautiful in a way, like something out of a postcard. We walked through, chatting and laughing, taking in the view, oblivious to how quickly the time was slipping away. It wasn't until we'd gotten about halfway through that we noticed something wasn't right. At first, it was just a small sound, like gravel shifting behind us. Then it happened again. And again. It was almost like something was moving behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. I remember feeling uneasy but brushing it off as nothing. Maybe just the rocks shifting, or the wind, who knows? But as we kept walking, the sound grew louder. It was like it was getting closer, and I could tell by the looks on everyone else's faces that they were starting to feel it too. But Mark, he didn't seem concerned. He kept saying it was nothing and urged us to keep going. We trusted him. That was our first mistake. I'm not sure what exactly happened after that. Maybe the sound was the beginning of it, or maybe it was just bad luck. But all of a sudden, the ground beneath us started to shake. It wasn't just a small tremor. The rocks above us began to shift, and before any of us could react, the entire side of the canyon gave way. I remember the sound first, the screech of stone scraping against stone, the crashing and rumbling as the rocks began to tumble down. And then the dust. It was like the world went gray all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, and I remember feeling the ground jerk beneath me. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, trying to cover my face from the dirt and rocks. I could hear the others yelling, but everything was muffled. The chaos was overwhelming, like the world was collapsing in on itself. When the dust finally started to settle, I opened my eyes. The canyon walls had changed. What had once been a clear path was now a mess of rocks and debris, completely blocking our way. Mark was the closest to me, his face covered in dirt, but he was alive. I could see he was trying to stand, his legs shaky. We all helped each other up, but the reality of the situation hit hard. We were trapped. The narrow canyon we'd been walking through was now impassable, and there was no way to climb out. I remember looking up and realizing that the canyon walls were too steep, too smooth to climb. And no matter how many times we shouted, no one came. We were completely alone. There were no other hikers, no signs of life, just the sound of the wind and our panic breathing. I looked around at the others. We had a few supplies of water, some food, our basic camping gear, but nothing that could help us get out of there. The worst part was the silence. It felt like we were miles from help, and in that moment, it hit me that no one knew where we were. We hadn't checked in with anyone, and I wasn't sure anyone even knew which way we'd gone. We hadn't planned for something like this. The first few hours were spent trying to move the rocks, trying to dig our way out, but it was useless. Every time we thought we found a way through, more rocks would shift, making it harder to get through. We had enough water to last us a while, but that didn't make the fear go away. It was becoming clear that our time was running out. We couldn't stay here. We needed to get out. By nightfall, things got worse. It was already getting cold, and the air was thick with dust. We huddled together for warmth, but I could tell we were all exhausted. Mark was the one trying to keep everyone calm, but even he seemed rattled. No one said it out loud, but we all knew it, we were stuck. No one was coming to help, and the rocks above us could still fall. We rationed the food and water, but with the days dragging on, it didn't seem like it would be enough. The next morning, we made a decision. There wasn't much we could do at that point, but we had to try something. We needed to get to higher ground to see if we could find a way out. But even that felt like a stretch. As we moved toward the top of the canyon, trying to find a way through the rocks, one of the guys, Sam, tripped and twisted his ankle. It wasn't just a sprain. The way he screamed when he fell, I knew it was bad. We had to stop and tend to him, and that delayed us even further. But in the back of my mind, I knew that we were running out of time. The reality was starting to sink in. After a few days, when it seemed like we might not make it out, something changed. We had all been silently wondering if it was possible that we weren't alone in this canyon. The silence around us was so complete that it felt unnatural. And then, one afternoon, Mark disappeared. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if he was trying to find help, or if he'd just gone crazy, but he was gone. He'd left without a word. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. It felt like he just vanished. That's when I knew we weren't going to make it out without help. It was too dangerous to keep going alone. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I managed to climb up to the top of the canyon, to a small ledge where I could get a better view. From there, I could see the main trail that we had taken days earlier. I could see the small stream where we had camped, just a few miles away. I knew we had to make it. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance we had left. We made it back to camp just in time. It was a hard climb down, and Sam was still hurt, but we made it. I don't know how we survived that canyon, but we did. We were lucky, I guess. I still don't know what happened to Mark. I still don't know how I ended up in that situation. I tell myself I made the wrong turn or took the wrong path, but the truth is, I should have just stayed in my tent. If I had, maybe none of this would have happened. It all started like any other solo camping trip. I had set up camp in a remote area of the forest, a place I'd found while researching spots online. The weather was perfect, and it had been a few days of peaceful solitude. I spent my time hiking, reading, and enjoying the quiet. But on the third evening, things took a turn. I had gone out for a short evening walk to stretch my legs. My plan was to wander a little further along the trail and then turn back before nightfall. I wasn't planning to go far, but when the sun began to set, I took a path I didn't recognize. The woods here were dense and overgrown, and the fading light made everything look different than it had earlier in the day. Still, I wasn't too concerned. I'd hiked a lot, and I had a decent sense of direction. Then, I heard voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but it was too distinct to be that. It was talking, clear as day. I moved toward the sound, thinking maybe it was another hiker or a group of campers nearby. As I got closer, I spotted them, 4 people standing in a small clearing near the base of a large oak tree. I couldn't see their faces at first, but they were all standing still, facing each other. Their voices were low, but they seemed to be in conversation. I stepped closer, calling out a friendly greeting. I wasn't nervous yet. I thought maybe they were just resting or taking a break from hiking. "Hey there," I said, trying to sound casual. "You folks out here for a hike?" One of them turned to face me, a man in his early 30s, I guess. He smiled, but it was odd. It wasn't the kind of smile I expected. It didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just passing through," he said, his voice calm but flat. I didn't think much of it at the time. I introduced myself, and they introduced themselves in turn. There was another man, a woman, and a teenage boy with them. They all seemed nice enough. They told me they were hikers from a nearby town and had just been out for a few days, doing a little trail exploration. They weren't far from where I'd set up camp, they said, but they had no plans to stay for long. We talked for a while, but there was something off about it. The conversation didn't flow the way it usually does with strangers. It felt a little stilted, like they weren't really listening to me. They mostly talked amongst themselves, and their words felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced them before. The silence between the words made me feel uncomfortable, but I kept telling myself I was overthinking things. I was alone in the woods, and maybe I just wasn't used to company. After a while, the sun had almost completely set, and I felt the chill of the night settling in. I knew it was time to leave, so I said my goodbyes and started to walk back toward my camp. But before I could go, the man who had spoken to me earlier said something odd. "Hey, if you want to join us for the night, you're welcome. We've got a fire going," he said, gesturing toward a small campfire behind them. At that point, I didn't really want to stay, but something about his offer felt polite, I guess. I don't know. It wasn't like I had any real reason to refuse, so I agreed, telling myself that I could leave at any time. We walked back to their camp together. It was a little further from the clearing where I'd met them, hidden behind some thick trees. They had a small fire going in the middle of their camp, surrounded by some logs that they used for sitting. The group didn't say much after we arrived. They just sat around the fire, staring into it. There was no conversation, no laughter, nothing to suggest the kind of warm, campfire atmosphere you'd expect. I tried to start a few casual conversations, asking about their hike and where they were headed, but their answers were curt and almost mechanical. The longer I sat there, the more unsettled I became. The air felt too still, the fire too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man I had spoken to earlier, his name was Aaron, I think stayed silent for a long time. His gaze was locked on the fire, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The others didn't move either. They just stared at the fire, their faces shadowed in the flickering light. Even the teenage boy didn't say a word. Then, without warning, the silence broke. "We should start now," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Start what?" I thought. I didn't have the chance to ask, because he stood up abruptly and began walking toward the edge of the camp. The others followed without a word. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should leave or follow them. Part of me was telling me to leave, but another part of me felt compelled to stay, to understand what was going on. I decided to follow them. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the weird vibe I was getting from them, but I had to know what they were up to. They moved quietly, like shadows, into the woods. I kept my distance, watching them as they walked. Their steps were slow, deliberate, as if they were in no rush. After a while, we came to a small clearing, where they stopped and faced each other. Aaron spoke again, but this time, his voice was different. It was almost like he was reciting something. "The ritual must be complete," he said, his eyes still fixed on the firelight. The others nodded in unison. My heart started to race as I watched them. Something wasn't right. What followed made my skin crawl. They began moving in a circle, walking slowly around the clearing. At first, I thought they were just doing some kind of weird dance, but the longer I watched, the more it became clear that it was something far stranger. It was like they were following some kind of pattern, some kind of ritual. The air felt thick, like something was building, but I couldn't place what it was. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. My instincts told me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't tear myself away. I don't know why. Maybe I was frozen with fear, or maybe it was the fact that I knew if I left, they'd notice. They'd find me. But I didn't leave. Instead, I stayed hidden in the trees, watching them continue their strange movements. They kept circling around, their steps in sync, and every now and then, Aaron would mutter something that I couldn't understand. The whole thing felt like a performance, a ritual that had been rehearsed for a long time. Finally, when I couldn't take it any longer, I turned and ran. I didn't look back, I just ran. I don't know if they saw me leave, but I didn't care. I was miles away from their camp before I slowed down to catch my breath. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stick around, didn't want to know if they were still out there. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? But every time I go camping, every time I'm out in the woods, I wonder, what were they doing? What were they trying to do? I don't know. I don't think I ever want to know. We had been camping for 2 days when it all started. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a group of friends looking to disconnect from our busy lives and spend some time in nature. No cell service, no distractions, just us in the woods. It was peaceful at first, just what we needed. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of the wind in the trees. We set up camp near a small creek, and everything was fine for the first day. We brought a portable radio with us to pass the time in the evenings. It was a cheap one, not anything fancy, just one of those small battery-operated models that could pick up the basic AM/FM stations. On the second night, after dinner and a few drinks, we sat around the fire and turned it on to see what we could pick up. There was nothing much on the regular stations, just static, so we started turning the dial randomly to see if we could find something more interesting. At first, it didn't seem like anything was out of the ordinary. We laughed, joked, and tried to make sense of the strange sounds we were hearing. The static would cut in and out, and we'd get fragments of voices now and then, but it was so garbled we could barely understand anything. We figured it was just bad reception, or maybe the batteries were starting to die. It wasn't until we started hearing clearer words that we began to get uneasy. It started with just a few short phrases. I remember one of the first ones, "They know where you are." It was barely audible at first, almost like a whisper lost in the static. At first, we thought it was just interference, something harmless. But the longer we listened, the more the voices began to come through. They were more distinct now, more deliberate. "Don't trust them. Stay inside tonight." It was the kind of thing that made you freeze for a moment. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Was it a prank? Maybe some weird channel or station that was messing with us. But the voices, they didn't sound like radio hosts or anything normal. They sounded wrong. Like someone was trying to get a message through, but something was off. At first, we dismissed it. We laughed it off, tried to brush it away. We turned the dial again, and the voices stopped. We found another station, and the rest of the night went by quietly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing the words in my head, "Stay inside tonight." The next day, we went hiking during the day. It was a beautiful trail, and we enjoyed it, trying to forget about the strange occurrence from the night before. But when we got back to camp, the radio was still there, sitting on the log next to the fire pit. It was hard not to think about what happened, especially since the feeling in the air had changed. The wind had picked up, and the forest felt denser, like it was closing in on us. We didn't talk much about the radio. No one wanted to bring it up, but I think we were all thinking about it. It wasn't until nightfall that things really started to get strange. We sat down by the fire again, and one of us, Chris, I think, decided to mess with the radio again. This time, it wasn't just a few words. We picked up a full sentence, and it wasn't just static anymore. It was a voice, clear as day, like someone was right there with us. "Get out of the woods." We froze. It wasn't one of us, it wasn't a joke. It was a deep, raspy voice, almost threatening. The kind of voice that made your blood run cold. We all turned to look at each other, confused, but none of us said anything. Chris quickly turned the dial to another station, and for a few minutes, the radio was silent again. But it didn't stay that way. The static returned, but this time the words were louder, clearer, more urgent. "They know you're here. They're watching." That's when it really hit me. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a coincidence. There was no way it could be. Someone was sending these messages. But who? And why? We tried turning the radio off, but as soon as we turned it back on, the same voice came through. "Don't trust them. They're coming for you." At that point, I think we all realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just a weird coincidence anymore. I don't know what it was, but something was out there, and it knew we were here. The voices weren't random, they were directed at us. We didn't know what to do. We debated packing up and leaving, but it was getting late, and none of us wanted to make the hike back in the dark. We tried to stay calm, but every time we heard those messages, it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The firelight flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching toward us. The worst part was when the messages started to get more specific. "You're not alone. Come out. We know you're hiding." That last one hit me the hardest. We weren't hiding. We were sitting there, by the fire, in plain sight. But the voice made it sound like we were being watched, like someone was waiting for us to make a move. I don't know how much time passed after that. We were all on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement in the trees. No one spoke for a long time. We just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the radio crackling in the background. Then, around midnight, it happened. The message came through again, only this time it wasn't a warning. It was a command. "Leave the camp. Now." I don't think any of us hesitated. We grabbed our things, packed up as quickly as we could, and started to head out. I don't know what we thought we were running from, but we couldn't stay there anymore. It felt like we were being hunted. We made it back to the parking lot and into our cars. No one said a word. We just got in, started the engines, and left. As we drove away, the radio continued to crackle behind us, but we didn't dare turn it back on. We never went back to that spot. We couldn't. The feeling of being watched, the messages, the way the forest felt like it was closing in on us, it was too much. To this day, I don't know who was sending those messages. I don't know what they wanted or why they were following us. But I do know that something was out there in those woods, something that wanted us to leave. And I'm not ever going back to find out who or what it was. I don't know how to explain what happened that night, but I know I'll never forget it. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear footsteps outside my tent, even though I know I'm safe now. I've been camping a lot in my life, mostly by myself. It's the only way I can really clear my head, get away from everything, and just think. I'd gone out to a remote site in the woods, not too far from town, but far enough that I was pretty much alone. The kind of place where you're not likely to run into anyone. It was my second night out there. I had set up camp by a small creek, surrounded by tall trees. The sun had set hours ago, and the fire had burned down to embers. I was inside my tent, reading a book and listening to the sounds of the night. It wasn't a full moon, but the sky was clear, and there was just enough light from the stars and the glow of the embers to see a little around the campsite. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing something. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was something more distinct, footsteps. I didn't want to overthink it, but they were too close, too deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps were light, but they were steady and moving around the perimeter of my tent, circling it. I lay there in the dark, tense, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps weren't the kind you'd expect from wildlife. They were heavier, more purposeful. I heard them pause for a moment, then resume walking. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? Was someone lost? But I hadn't seen anyone else around. There were no other camps nearby, and the thought of someone else being out here this late walking around my tent, so close, was enough to make my stomach twist. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just a little and peered out into the dark. The forest was eerily quiet now. No more footsteps. It was hard to see much beyond the reach of the dim light from my campfire. The shadows of the trees stretched across the ground, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing. I shut the tent flap quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been right outside, watching. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I spent the next few hours awake, listening for any other sounds. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense up. I didn't sleep at all. I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, but nothing came. Finally, around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, sunlight peeking through the fabric of my tent. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm myself down. The night felt like a strange dream, but I knew it wasn't. The footsteps, the silence, the feeling that someone had been so close it was real. I didn't even want to check outside, but I knew I had to. I needed to see if anything was out of place, or if I was just being paranoid. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the ground was damp with morning dew. The fire was just a pile of cold ashes now, and everything was still. At first glance, it seemed like nothing had changed. But then I noticed something. My gear, my backpack, and some of the other things I had left around the tent had been moved. Not by a lot, but enough that it wasn't where I'd left it. My backpack, which had been leaning against a tree, was now lying a few feet away, half open. My water bottle had been knocked over, and the small flashlight I always kept by my side was in a different spot than I remembered. It wasn't a huge mess, but it was clear that someone had been through my things. My stomach turned. I checked the rest of the camp. The area around the tent was untouched, but I still had that sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I walked over to the creek and looked down at the water. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That someone had been watching me all night. The worst part was the silence. There were no other campers nearby. No one else in the woods. The footsteps I heard, they couldn't have been from an animal. No animal would have been so close to my tent and walked around it in such a deliberate way. I couldn't explain it. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying to get out of there. I wasn't going to stay another night. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something wasn't right. Whoever had been out there, they knew I was alone. And I had no idea if they were still out there, waiting. As I loaded up my gear into my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone walking toward me from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the woods, quiet as ever. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The footsteps. The way everything had been moved. I don't know if I'll ever understand who or what it was. But I know I'm never camping alone in those woods again. The thought that someone could be out there, watching, that close, it's something I can't shake. We had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, just the four of us, out in the wilderness for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and a bit of relaxation. It was a fairly remote site, a campsite that had been reserved in advance. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into too many people, just the peace and quiet of the forest. We arrived a little later than planned, just as the sun was dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. We were all tired, but excited, ready to set up camp. When we pulled into the area, we noticed something right away. It wasn't what we expected. The spot where our camp should have been was empty, but there was something else there, a mess. The tents, all of them, were torn and half collapsed. Some were shredded, others just left in a pile, and there was a faint smell in the air, kind of sour and rotting. We all got out of the truck, staring at the mess. At first, I thought it might have been an animal. Maybe a bear or something had gotten into the camp and destroyed everything. But there was something off about it. It didn't feel right. Maybe it's just an old camp, Mark suggested. He's always the one trying to make light of things. Maybe they didn't clean up or something. But as we looked around, it was clear this wasn't just some careless camp. The food that was left out was rotten cans of beans and tuna, half-open bags of chips, and boxes of crackers. All of it was covered in mold. The smell was unbearable. We walked further into the camp, and that's when I noticed the markings on the trees. They weren't just scratches or random carvings. They were deliberate, almost like symbols, but I couldn't make sense of them. They looked old, but also fresh, like someone had marked them recently. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, pointing at one of the trees. The symbol was crudely scratched into the bark, something jagged and unnatural. We all stood there for a second, unsure of what to make of it. There was no sign of any people around. Just the empty, destroyed camp and the strange markings. I felt uneasy, like we weren't supposed to be there. Mark was still trying to make it seem less alarming, like it was just a coincidence. He suggested we go ahead and set up our camp anyway, even though this wasn't our designated spot. The site wasn't far from where we had planned to camp, so we figured it wouldn't hurt to just stay there for the night. We started unpacking, and that's when we realized something else. There were things missing, small things at first. My lighter, Sarah's small first aid kit, and some of our water bottles. At first, I thought we were just misplacing them, but then I realized someone else must have been here recently. Maybe we weren't the only ones who found this site. I mentioned it to the group, but everyone else shrugged it off. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip. The sun had almost set, so we started the campfire and decided to have dinner. That's when the sound started. At first, it was nothing, just the usual rustling of the trees and the crackling of the fire. But then, we heard something else. It was quiet at first, footsteps, soft and slow, like someone walking around our camp. It wasn't a random noise, it was deliberate, like someone was moving around the perimeter. We all stopped talking, listening. The footsteps came closer. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like we were being watched. I told everyone to stay quiet. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, and we all huddled together, staring out into the dark. I was about to say something, but then I heard a twig snap, and that's when I saw it. In the distance, near the edge of the camp, a shadow moved between the trees. It was just for a second, but it was enough. Someone was out there. Someone who shouldn't be. I don't know why, but I felt sick, like something wasn't right. Sarah was the first to stand up, telling everyone to stay calm. She was usually the calm one in the group. She suggested we head to the truck, just to be safe. But when we went to grab our things, that's when we found it. The truck, the one we parked just a few hours earlier, was gone. It didn't make any sense. We hadn't driven anywhere. None of us had. But the truck was gone. The spot where we parked it was empty, the dirt and gravel untouched. It was like it had never been there. I don't know what kind of game this was, but I was starting to panic. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no way out. We decided to take a look around the camp again, maybe try to figure out if there was anything we missed. That's when I found the note. It was stuck to the underside of one of the broken tents. A small piece of paper, yellowed with age, with strange handwriting on it. It wasn't in any language I recognized, and it made my skin crawl just looking at it. I couldn't make out most of it, but at the bottom of the page, there was a date almost a year ago, to the day. The same time of year. And then, below it, one last line, they never left. I showed the others, and Sarah looked as pale as I felt. Mark was quiet for once. We all stood there, staring at the note. That's when we realized the truth. The people who had been here before, they were gone. They had vanished. No sign of them anywhere. And whatever had happened to them, it wasn't something we wanted to find out. We packed up our things and started walking in the opposite direction, away from the camp. The symbols on the trees, the weird note, the truck gone, it all started to make sense in a way that terrified me. Whoever had been here before us, whoever had left that note, they weren't normal. And I wasn't about to stick around to find out what had happened to them. As we walked away from the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest road, and even then, I couldn't stop looking back into the trees, waiting for something or someone to come after us. We never went back to that place. We don't talk about it anymore, but sometimes, when we're all together, we'll mention it in passing. We don't speak of it too much. I don't think any of us ever really got over what happened that weekend. But one thing I know for sure is that there's something in those woods. Something we'll never understand. I've been camping a lot, and I've always loved the solitude that comes with being in the wilderness. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, especially when I'm out in nature. I usually find peace there. But what happened to me last year, in a remote spot I'd never been to before, has completely changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. It started out like any other solo trip. I found a spot off the beaten path, no one around for miles, just me and the trees. I set up my tent as usual, made a small fire, and started cooking dinner. The air was crisp, and it was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. Nothing unusual. Just the kind of peaceful, serene setting I had been craving. That night, after I had eaten and the fire had died down, I crawled into my sleeping bag, tired but content. The night was cold, the kind of cold that makes you appreciate being tucked inside a warm sleeping bag. The wind picked up a little, making the trees sway. Everything was calm until I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft crunch of dirt or leaves. I figured it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, moving through the forest. But then it stopped. Just like that. I froze, listening. Everything went quiet. A few minutes passed, and I tried to settle back down, thinking it was nothing. But then I heard it again. The crunching sound, this time louder. Closer. My heart started to beat faster. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind. I pulled the covers tighter and listened again. There it was. Footsteps. No animal would make that kind of sound. These were heavy, deliberate steps. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving slowly, carefully, as if they were trying not to make noise, but failing. I couldn't help it. I grabbed the flashlight I always keep by my side and unzipped the tent a little, just enough to peek outside. The night was pitch black, except for the glow of my campfire, which had nearly burned out. The light barely reached beyond the small circle around the fire. But in that small light, I didn't see anything. No movement. No figure. Just shadows. I waited a few more minutes, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Probably just a raccoon or some other animal. But the footsteps started again. Only this time, they were closer. A lot closer. I could hear them clearly, and they weren't moving like an animal. It was human, or at least, something walking like a human. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my knife for protection and unzipped the tent fully, stepping outside, shining my flashlight in every direction. The air was still and cold. The footsteps stopped as soon as I was outside, but I couldn't see anyone. No movement. I checked the surrounding trees, the shadows, but everything was still. My heart was pounding in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The only sounds I could hear were the wind and the occasional crackling from my campfire. There was no one. I started to think I was just imagining things. I was alone. I knew I was alone. But then, just as I was about to go back into the tent, I heard it again. This time, it was behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped again, and I felt that strange, uneasy silence surrounding me. My instincts were telling me to stay calm, but I was scared. I don't scare easily, but that night, alone in the dark, I felt like something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night awake, lying there with the knife in my hand, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every time I almost drifted off, I'd hear the footsteps again. They seemed to be circling me, like whoever it was knew I was listening and was waiting for me to let my guard down. It felt like they were taunting me, getting closer every time, but when I tried to confront them, they would stop, leaving me in a tense, silent waiting game. Hours passed like this. Finally, when the first light of morning broke through the trees, I heard nothing anymore. The footsteps stopped for good. I didn't sleep at all that night, just kept my eyes open, waiting, hoping the morning would bring some relief. And when I finally saw the sun starting to rise, I packed up my things quickly. I wasn't staying another minute. When I got out of the tent to stretch my legs and gather my stuff, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around my campsite, all the way around the fire pit and my tent, were muddy footprints. They weren't animal tracks. These were human tracks, big ones, like a man's boots. And they were all over the place, going in circles around my camp, getting close to my tent, and then veering off. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been there. Someone had been walking around my tent all night, and I didn't hear them leave. I couldn't make sense of it. The tracks were fresh, but there was no sign of anyone nearby now. No sign of them leaving or anything else out of the ordinary. But the realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Whoever it was had been watching me, and they had been there the entire night, just out of my sight, circling my camp. I don't know why they hadn't done anything else, but the thought of it sent me into a panic. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not even bothering to make sure everything was perfectly packed. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole way back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. But there was nothing. Nothing but the silence of the woods. I haven't gone camping alone since that trip, and I don't think I ever will again. Even now, just thinking about it, I feel that same chill down my spine. Whoever it was, whether they were just some kind of sick person playing games or someone with worse intentions, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to move silently, how to make sure I never saw them. And I'll never forget those muddy footprints circling my camp, the footsteps I heard all night, always stopping just when I tried to confront them. Something about that situation felt so wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I was never meant to leave. If there's one thing I've learned from that night, it's that the woods aren't always as peaceful as they seem. And when you're alone out there, anything can happen. Anything at all. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance for the group to escape the noise of city life and get back to nature. There were 5 of us, me, my brother, his girlfriend, my best friend, and her cousin. Nothing special, just a weekend hike into some remote area. We'd been planning it for months, picking out a spot we thought would be quiet and secluded. None of us were expecting anything to go wrong. We were just looking forward to some time by the fire, some good food, and maybe a few hikes through the woods. The first day went off without a hitch. We set up camp at a small clearing near a creek, made a fire, and spent the evening talking, cooking dinner, and drinking a little. The place was perfect, quiet, private, just far enough off the trail to feel like we were really away from everything. The forest felt peaceful, even a little magical. At least, that's how I saw it then. But things started to feel off on the second day. We woke up to the sound of birds, but there was something wrong with the quiet. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet you expect in nature, where it's just peaceful and calm. It felt too still, like the air was holding its breath. Still, we brushed it off, made some breakfast, and headed out for a hike. It was a long walk, more than we had planned, but none of us really cared. We were all in good spirits, just enjoying the fresh air. When we got back to camp around late afternoon, something felt strange. The whole area around the clearing seemed darker, even though it was still light outside. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just felt uneasy. We went about setting up for dinner, but it was hard to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the tiredness setting in. After we ate, my brother and I decided to take a walk to stretch our legs and clear our heads. The rest of the group stayed by the fire, talking and laughing. It was just a short walk down the trail that led back to the road where we parked. We weren't going to leave camp, just wander a little to get some fresh air. That's when we saw it. About half a mile down the trail, right where the road met the wooded area, there was a gate, rusted, heavy, and completely out of place. It was blocking the path, completely shutting off the only way out. We both stopped dead in our tracks when we saw it. It wasn't there when we first arrived, not even close. We had walked down this same path that morning, and there had been nothing. The road was wide open, just like it should be. But now, in front of us, was a tall, metal gate that looked like it had been there for decades. I thought it was some sort of private property gate, maybe someone who lived nearby had put it up. My brother suggested it was an old hunting camp or a ranch that used to be around, but I didn't buy it. Something about it didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, like it had been placed there specifically to block us in. We tried to push on the gate, but it was locked, and there were no signs, no markings, nothing to explain why it was there. We looked around for any kind of indication of who might own it, but the woods were completely silent. No houses, no roads, nothing. Just the endless trees on all sides. After a few minutes of trying to figure out how to get through, we decided to head back to camp and tell the others. As we walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around us seemed so quiet, but I kept hearing small sounds, branches cracking, the rustle of leaves. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like something was just out of view, lurking. When we got back to the campsite, we told the others about the gate. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought it was some kind of mistake, or maybe a prank. But when we walked them down the trail to show them, the gate was still there. We all stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. The sunlight was fading fast, and the whole place suddenly felt darker, colder. None of us really knew what to do. We had no way of contacting anyone since we didn't have cell service, and the gate was the only way out. We couldn't just stay here forever. So, we all decided to sleep on it and figure things out in the morning. We made sure to lock up the tent and keep the fire going, but no one felt at ease. Everyone kept glancing at the gate, the darkening woods beyond, like they were expecting something to happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds in the woods outside the tent were off, almost like something or someone was moving around. I kept hearing footsteps, faint at first, then closer. I thought maybe it was just an animal, but then I realized that these footsteps didn't sound like they were coming from the usual direction. They were too slow, too deliberate. And they seemed to stop when I tried to listen more closely, as if someone was standing perfectly still, waiting for me to look. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every time I almost drifted off, I'd hear them again, just outside the tent. I got up to check the fire, but it was still going strong. No one else was awake. Everything was quiet again, but I felt it. There was something wrong. In the morning, we packed up our things, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't just leave the way we came. The gate was still there, locked in place. And there was no way around it. The road behind us was blocked by a thick wall of trees, with no visible way through. We debated for a while on whether to try climbing the gate, but it was too high, and there was no way to know who might be on the other side. After a few hours, we finally made the decision to head deeper into the woods, hoping we could find another way out. But when we turned back onto the main trail, we were met with something even worse. The gate wasn't the only thing blocking us anymore. The whole trail seemed to have been altered, like someone or something had intentionally moved things to keep us from leaving. Rocks were piled up, branches were snapped and laid across the path, and the trees themselves seemed to loom closer, more menacing. I'm not sure how to explain it, but there was no mistaking it. We were being trapped. That's when we realized that someone, or something, didn't want us to leave. The whole experience was so unsettling, and it was clear that we weren't just dealing with a simple gate that had been put up for some unknown reason. Whoever or whatever was out there was making sure we stayed put. We never found out who was behind it all. After hours of wandering the woods, trying every possible path, we managed to find a back trail that led us to a neighboring road. We made it out, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, waiting for us to slip up. Every sound, every crack of a twig, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. I don't know if we were just unlucky or if it was something more, but I'll never forget that locked gate or the feeling of being trapped out there, helpless, with no idea who or what was keeping us from leaving. And I'll never go back to that place again. I don't even know where to begin. I've been trying to tell myself it was nothing, just some weird misunderstanding, but I can't shake it. Not after what happened. It started out so normal. We were camping, just the two of us, my girlfriend, Emma, and me. We had picked out a spot deep in the woods, far away from the crowds. We wanted peace, quiet, and the chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. The first day went well. We set up our tent by a small creek, started a fire, and just relaxed. It was a beautiful spot, nothing out of the ordinary. No strange feelings, no weird vibes. Just the two of us talking and laughing, enjoying the evening. It wasn't until the second night that things got strange. It started with them. A group of campers. We hadn't seen them before, but around dusk, they appeared by the fire. They seemed friendly enough, two guys and a woman walking along the trail not far from our site. At first, we barely noticed them, but one of them called out, asking if we wanted to join them for a drink. We had nothing planned for the evening, so we figured, why not? We walked over to their camp, and they were sitting around a fire, the flames casting long shadows in the trees. They had a couple of beers, a bottle of whiskey, and a few snacks. It seemed normal enough. We introduced ourselves, and they were nice. Not overly friendly, but polite. We all started talking, mostly about where we were from and how we ended up here. I'll admit, the conversation was a little awkward at first, but after a few drinks, it loosened up. It was just casual chatter at first, nothing strange. They told us they had been camping in the area for a while, moving from place to place, exploring different parts of the woods. They said they liked the solitude, and I could see that. It wasn't a surprise that they'd come up here to get away from it all. The woman, her name was Claire, was nice enough. But there was something about her smile that felt a little too sharp, a little too knowing. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was nothing, but I kept getting this feeling that she was watching me just a bit too closely. Every time I glance over at her, she'd be looking right at me, and when our eyes met, she'd smile. It didn't feel threatening, not exactly, but there was something unsettling about it. As the night wore on, the mood seemed to shift. It wasn't overt, but it was there. The guys started making more jokes, laughing a bit too loud, and Claire seemed to get quieter, just watching. I remember trying to keep the conversation going, but it felt like I was the only one still trying. Emma had already finished her drink and looked a little tired, like she was ready to head back to our camp. I felt the same, honestly. The night had stretched on longer than we planned. So, we told them we were going to head back. That's when things started to get weird. At first, it was subtle. One of the guys, Dave, I think his name was, stood up and clapped me on the shoulder, laughing. "You guys aren't going anywhere," he said, too loudly. "The night's still young. Come on, stay for a bit." I chuckled awkwardly, not really feeling like staying. "We're pretty tired," I said, trying to keep it light. "Maybe another time." But then Claire spoke. "You don't want to go yet," she said, and her voice had changed. It wasn't threatening, but it had a kind of cold edge to it, like she wasn't asking anymore. "The night's beautiful. You won't find peace like this anywhere else. Just stay a little longer." I felt this sudden pressure, like they were all looking at us, waiting for an answer. Emma looked at me, and I could tell she was uncomfortable too, but she didn't want to make a scene. She nodded, giving a forced smile. "Maybe just a little longer," she said. I wasn't sure why, but something about it didn't sit right. The way they were staring at us made me feel like we didn't really have a choice. I tried to shake it off, but I could feel the tension building. It was like they were waiting for us to stay, to make us stay. I didn't want to be rude, but I knew we needed to get back. Emma had already started to gather her things. I stood up, ready to go, but Dave was standing just a little too close, blocking the path. "You don't need to go," he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost too calm. "We've got a few more drinks. Just relax." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something in his eyes, something that wasn't right. I tried to step around him, but he didn't move. It was like he was deliberately keeping me there, like they were all trying to keep us from leaving. "We really have to go," I said, my voice a little more firm now. "We've got stuff to do tomorrow." Claire stood up and took a step closer. "You'll be fine," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "It's not safe to walk back through the woods at night. Stay here." We'll keep you safe." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way she said it, like there was no other option. I felt trapped, like if I didn't go along with it, something worse might happen. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder to hide how uneasy I felt. I looked over at Emma, who seemed equally uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I could see her trying to make up her mind, her eyes darting around the camp, looking for an excuse, an out. "Look, we really appreciate it," Emma said, standing up and reaching for my hand. "But we're just going to go back. It's getting late." There was a long pause. I could feel their eyes on us, like they were waiting for us to say the right thing. Then, suddenly, Dave stepped aside, giving us just enough space to walk by. But as I passed him, he grabbed my arm, just a quick grip, tight enough to make me stop in my tracks. "You know," he said, his voice low, "if you really wanted to go, you wouldn't have said that. You'd be gone already." It was like a switch flipped. I didn't think. I just yanked my arm away and pulled Emma with me. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaky but firm. We didn't look back as we hurried down the trail, the light of their campfire flickering behind us, but I could feel them watching us. We didn't say anything to each other until we were safely back at our tent. We just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the darkness outside, not knowing if they were still out there. I still don't know what exactly happened, but I know that they didn't want us to leave. There was something about that whole interaction that felt wrong, like they were pushing us to stay for some reason. I haven't camped since then, and I don't know if I ever will again. I don't think I could handle it. Every time I close my eyes, I remember the way they looked at us, those smiles that never reached their eyes, and I can't shake the feeling that they weren't just trying to be friendly. They were trying to keep us there, and for what? I don't think I'll ever know. I've been putting off telling this story for a while, but it's been weighing on me, and I just need to get it out. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but what happened to me was real. I'll start from the beginning, even though every time I think about it, I can't help but get a little shaky. It was supposed to be a peaceful solo hike. I've been camping and hiking for years, so I wasn't worried about being out there alone. I know how to navigate, how to read maps, and I always made sure I'm prepared. I picked a trail that was relatively remote. It was one I'd heard about from a few friends but had never been on myself. It seemed perfect. Quiet, not a lot of people, and I figured I'd have a nice few days in the woods to clear my head. The first day was perfect. The weather was clear, the trail wasn't too difficult, and I was enjoying the silence. I didn't see anyone else out there, which was exactly what I wanted. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird calling from above. By late afternoon, I found a good spot by a small creek, set up my tent, and built a fire. It was peaceful. I spent the evening reading and cooking a simple meal. It was the second day when things started to get strange. I woke up early, packed up my stuff, and hit the trail again. The path took me deeper into the woods, where the trees were thick and the air was cooler. About halfway through the day, I stopped for a break, sitting on a log by the side of the trail. I was sipping water from my bottle when I noticed something strange, a carving on a tree, just off the trail. It wasn't big, but it was clear enough to see, and it looked recent. The message was simple: turn back. Danger ahead. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual to see carvings or markings on trees in remote areas. Sometimes people leave messages or trail markers. I figured it was just someone's idea of a joke or maybe a warning from another hiker who'd gotten turned around. Still, It was a little unsettling. I looked around to see if anyone else was nearby, but the woods were still, no movement at all. It was completely silent. I stood up, wiped my hands on my pants, and decided to continue on. I wasn't about to let some random carving scare me off. I've been hiking enough to know that not every warning should be taken seriously. I was determined to keep going, so I didn't even hesitate. The next couple of hours felt fine. The trail was challenging, but not too difficult. I was enjoying the solitude again, not thinking about the carving anymore. I wasn't entirely focused on the trail, though, and I kept noticing things that felt off. Little things at first, like hearing twigs snapping behind me, or the sound of something moving through the brush, just out of sight. I thought it was probably just animals, maybe a deer or something, so I didn't pay it much attention. But then it started happening more frequently. It was the moment I reached a small clearing that I felt it for the first time, this nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the usual sense of being in nature. This felt different. I didn't hear any footsteps or see anyone, but it was like someone was watching me from behind the trees. I glanced around, but I didn't see anyone. I tried to push the feeling aside. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I sat down for a minute, took out my map, and checked my position. I knew the trail was going to split soon, and I was looking for the marker that would tell me which path to take. When I stood up to keep going, I heard it again this time. I was sure of it. A twig snapped behind me, followed by a low rustling sound. It was too close to be an animal, and it wasn't the wind. I froze. I didn't turn around right away. I just stood there, listening. For a long time, nothing happened. But the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. My heart started to pound, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. I glanced over my shoulder, but the woods were still. No one was there. I started walking faster, hoping it was nothing. I kept going for maybe another hour, my pace quickening with every step. The further I went, the more the feeling of being followed grew. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but it was hard to ignore. The rustling behind me seemed to be getting closer. Every time I stopped for a break, I would hear it again, those same sounds, just out of sight. By now, my nerves were shot. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was walking behind me, always just far enough away that I couldn't see them. It was like they were mimicking my movements, stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved. My stomach was in knots, and my mind kept going back to that carving on the tree. Turn back. Danger ahead. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone who was taking a different route. But as the hours went on, I started to doubt that. The woods around me had grown darker, and the atmosphere was thick with an oppressive quiet. There were no other sounds, no birds, no wind. Just me and the rustling behind me. I came to another clearing, but this one felt different. There was something off about it. The ground was bare, no grass, just dirt, and the trees surrounding it looked twisted, like they'd been bent in odd shapes. As I stepped into the clearing, I heard the noise again, louder this time. Someone was close. Too close. I froze again, and this time, I didn't turn around. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, listening. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just imagining it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. There was someone standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible. I could see them, but they weren't moving. Just standing there, watching me. My heart raced. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they had to be looking at me. I took a deep breath, turned on my heel, and started running. I didn't care if I was on the trail or not. I just wanted to get away. My lungs burned as I pushed myself, my legs aching with each step. I didn't stop running until I found a small ridge and made my way down to a stream. I followed the stream for what felt like hours, too scared to look back, too scared to stop. Eventually, I made it to a campground I recognized, and by that point, I was a mess. I could still feel their presence in my mind, and the thought of turning around to face whatever was back there made me sick to my stomach. I never did find out who or what was following me, but I know for sure that I shouldn't have ignored that warning. It happened last summer, during a trip I'd been looking forward to for months. There were 5 of us friends who'd known each other for years, and this was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from everything. A weekend of hiking, campfires, and just getting away from the noise of life. We had picked a remote spot for our campsite, a place that wasn't far from a scenic lookout. We set up camp and spent the day hiking to the spot, taking in the view, talking about everything and nothing. It was beautiful, the kind of place where you could just lose yourself in the moment. The weather was perfect, and everything felt right. That's why, when the time came to head back to camp, I didn't think twice about it. We started the hike back around mid-afternoon, all of us chatting as we walked, just like we had on the way there. The path was a little more challenging on the return trip, mostly downhill, but nothing too serious. Everyone was in good spirits, tired but happy. I remember feeling a little lighter, knowing we'd be back at camp soon, ready to relax and enjoy the evening. But then, when we reached a fork in the trail, I noticed that one of us, Tom, wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe he had just fallen behind, so I called out to him. "Tom? You good back there?" No answer. I figured maybe he had stopped to take a picture or rest for a minute. We'd been stopping here and there, so it wasn't unusual. I kept walking, thinking he'd catch up, but after a while, I started to get that feeling. You know, the one where something doesn't feel right, but you can't put your finger on it? I stopped again. "Tom?" Louder this time, more urgent. Still nothing. At this point, I turned around. I'd walked a little further than I realized. I looked down the trail, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no movement. It was as if he had just vanished. I started walking back in the direction we came from, calling his name, trying to keep my voice steady. The others had noticed by now, and they began calling for him too. We all split up, each of us taking a different path, looking for Tom. We didn't want to panic, but it was hard not to. We kept looking for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no trail leading off the path, nothing that would tell us where he'd gone. I was starting to feel the panic rising in my chest, but I tried to keep it together. Tom was a big guy, he could handle himself. Maybe he'd just wandered off the path a little bit. Maybe he'd been ahead of us the whole time and we hadn't realized. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, I knew that if he was just ahead, he would have answered us by now. It wasn't until we all met back at the fork, empty-handed, that we decided to go back to camp. Maybe he'd gotten tired of searching and went back to wait for us. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, that gnawing unease that something wasn't right. The hike back to camp felt longer than it should have. Maybe it was the quiet that made it seem that way. The silence was unnerving. Not a single bird chirped, no wind rustled through the trees. It was dead still, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. When we got back to camp, it was as if nothing had changed. The fire was still out, our tier was just where we'd left it. But there was something off. I didn't know what it was at first, but it hit me when I saw Tom's backpack still by the fire. His tent was still standing, his sleeping bag rolled up neatly inside. Everything was in place. Everything except him. We all stood there in silence for a moment, just staring at his stuff. No one spoke. No one wanted to. I don't know how long we stood there, but the quiet was suffocating. None of us wanted to go inside the tents. No one wanted to be alone in that silence, but we couldn't ignore it. There were 5 of us, and Tom was supposed to be with us, but he wasn't. We called out for him again, our voices echoing into the dark, but there was no reply. I know I should have been more logical, but everything inside me was telling me something was wrong. Something had happened to him. I thought about going back out to look for him, but the thought of wandering those woods in the dark alone was terrifying. We didn't have a lot of light left, and the idea of searching for him with no real sense of direction, it wasn't safe. We all just kind of stood there, not knowing what to do. We decided to wait until morning. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe he'd gotten lost or hurt, and he was trying to make his way back. We kept the fire going, our voices quiet, too aware of the silence around us. It felt like the woods were closing in, like we were waiting for something. No one slept. We stayed by the fire, huddled together, watching the shadows move in the trees. Every crackling noise, every snap of a twig had us on edge. The hours dragged on, and the darkness seemed endless. In the morning, we woke up with a sense of dread that had been building all night. The fire had died down to embers, and the sun was barely up. We all looked at each other, but no one wanted to be the first to speak. We were all thinking the same thing. Tom was still gone. We decided to check the trail again, this time sticking together. We retraced every step we'd taken the day before, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. But the trail was still empty. There was nothing. Not a single clue to where he'd gone. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, no broken branches. And that's when we noticed it, something I had missed the first time we walked back to camp. His gear was untouched. The same backpack that had been sitting by the fire the night before was still there. His sleeping bag, his boots, even his jacket, all of it was just sitting there like he'd walked off and forgotten to take it with him. But that didn't make sense. If he'd left voluntarily, why would he leave everything behind? The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Not even the sound of the wind. Nothing. I don't know what happened to him. I don't think we'll ever know. But I know that I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something else was out there, something that didn't want us to leave, didn't want us to find Tom. The whole experience left me with more questions than answers. Tom never came back, and no one ever found any sign of him. It felt like he had just disappeared. To this day, when I think back on that weekend, I can't stop wondering, did we miss something? Or did we just make the wrong decision by staying? It started as a normal hike, at least that's what I kept telling myself. I've always loved the outdoors, and this trail was a popular one. I'd heard good things about it, and a few friends had hiked it before. So, when I was able to get a group together, I thought it would be the perfect weekend getaway. There were 4 of us, me, Sarah, Max, and Charlie. We were all seasoned hikers, so we weren't worried about the difficulty of the trail. We planned out our route and were ready to take it slow, stop at the scenic spots, and enjoy the time together. The first day was uneventful. We started early, the weather was perfect, and everything felt right. We stopped every few miles to rest, check out the views, and snack. There were other hikers around, but nothing unusual. Everyone was just doing their thing, and we were doing ours. It was our third rest stop that we met them. I can't even remember their names now, but I'll never forget their faces. A couple, maybe in their late 30s, early 40s, came up to us while we were sitting by the side of the trail. They seemed friendly enough at first. Introduced themselves, asked if we were enjoying the hike, the usual small talk. What struck me as odd right away was how much they knew. "We saw you back at the first rest stop," the man said. His voice was smooth, friendly, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't place at the time. "Yeah, we took a quick break there too," Sarah replied, smiling politely. "Nice spot, isn't it?" the woman chimed in. "We noticed you guys are heading toward the summit, right?" It caught me off guard. I mean, of course, we were heading toward the summit. It was the whole point of the hike, but I didn't remember telling them that. We hadn't spoken to anyone else about our plans, at least not in detail. "Yeah," I said, "we're planning to make it to the top by the end of the day, take in the view." "Oh, that's great," the woman said with a smile. "You'll love the view, especially as the sun sets. It's the perfect time to be up there." I gave a polite nod, but the conversation felt strange. Too personal, too familiar, considering we had only just met them. Still, we weren't being rude, so we made small talk for a few more minutes before they left. They waved goodbye, and we watched them continue up the trail. After they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The way they knew our plans, the way they seemed to be watching us. I didn't want to say anything, not to make the others paranoid, but I felt a sense of unease creeping in. We continued on, but then it happened again. At our next stop, a couple of hours later, they appeared again. Just like before, they came up to us while we were resting. This time, they were asking about our pace, what we planned to do after reaching the summit, how long we thought it would take us. Again, they seemed way too familiar with our plans, asking questions that seemed innocent enough but were unsettling in the way they knew so much. By now, I was feeling uncomfortable. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it wasn't normal for strangers to show up at every stop. I kept looking around, half expecting them to pop out of the trees. Max noticed it too. "Are we being followed?" he asked quietly, leaning in toward me. "I don't know," I said. "But it's weird, right? I mean, how do they know what we're doing?" "I don't know," he said, "but we've only been on this trail for a day. What are the odds they're on the exact same schedule as us?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew something was off, but we couldn't prove it. And that's what bothered me the most. There was no solid reason to be scared. It was just a feeling, one that kept growing with each encounter. Later that evening, when we made camp, we were all a little on edge. We set up our tents, started a fire, and tried to get some rest. But every time we heard someone approaching, I tensed up. I kept expecting them to appear again, but they didn't. Or at least, not right away. Around dusk, just as the light was fading, the couple appeared once more. This time, they didn't even greet us, they just walked into our camp like they belonged there. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" the man said, smiling that same unnerving smile. "Yeah, it is," Sarah replied, but I could tell she was getting uncomfortable too. Her voice had that tight, forced quality to it. "We thought we'd check out your campsite," the woman said casually, glancing around. "It's nice. You're all set up for a good night." I wanted to tell them to leave, but I didn't know how. They hadn't done anything wrong exactly. They hadn't crossed any lines that I could point to. But they were too familiar, too intrusive. I could feel my stomach twisting in knots, and I could see that the others were starting to feel the same way. Max cleared his throat. "Well, it's getting late," he said, standing up. "We should probably turn in for the night. Big day tomorrow." The couple didn't seem to take the hint. They hung around for another few minutes, making small talk about the weather, about the wildlife in the area, but it wasn't just talk. They were watching us, studying us in a way that made me feel exposed, like they could see every little detail about us, like they were taking notes. Finally, they left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done with us. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound in the woods had me on edge, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside my tent. I know that sounds paranoid, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't help it. By morning, we were all feeling it. Tired, jumpy, like we couldn't trust anything around us. But we couldn't leave. We were committed to the hike, and there was no way out now. The next day, the couple was there again. This time, they were waiting for us at our next rest stop. They weren't hiding or sneaking around, they were just there, as if they had been waiting for us the whole time. "We've been ahead of you," the man said, like it was no big deal. "It's a nice little stretch of trail up there, but you might want to take it slow. The climb's a bit steeper than it looks." I looked at the others, and I could see the fear in their eyes. We all knew something was wrong now. It wasn't just the coincidences. It wasn't just the way they kept showing up. It was the way they acted, the way they knew things they shouldn't. I don't know what their plan was. I don't know what they wanted from us. But I do know this, by the time we reached the final stretch of the trail, I was done. I told the others we were leaving, that we were cutting the hike short, and I didn't care if we didn't finish. I didn't care if we missed the summit. We turned around and headed back down the trail. This time, we didn't stop at the rest stops. We didn't take any chances. The couple never showed up again, and by the time we got back to our car, I was so relieved I almost didn't care about how weird the whole thing had been. I don't know if they were just strange hikers, or if they had some other reason for following us. But I do know this, I'll never hike that trail again.